Chapter 6:18. Oh! Richelieu's eyebrows slightly raised as he slowly sat up from the bed. He controlled the 12 elders? When did such a powerful person appear in the outer wall? The gray figure bowed. According to the report from the Filon family, this person seems to be the 9th elder. It's him? There was a trace of surprise in Richelieu's eyes. Others didn't know the identity of the 9th elder, but he was clear about it. The little guy had disappeared for less than a few months. How could he have such ability? Tell me the details of the situation. Is there anyone among the 12 elders? Richelieu solemnly stared at the gray figure. Just as the gray figure was about to speak, a gust of cold wind suddenly blew in from the slightly opened window, causing the soft gauze curtain in the hall to flutter slightly. At the same time, a voice as indifferent as the cold wind sounded, "Your Holiness, if you want to know the situation at that time, why don't you ask me?" The two of them were startled and turned their heads to look. They saw 2 silhouettes standing quietly outside the soft gauze curtain. They were as silent as ghosts, as if they had been standing there for a long time. Be careful! When the gray figure saw these 2 people, he quickly reacted. A cold light flashed in his eyes, and his figure suddenly flew over. He pulled out the light dagger from his waist, and held it behind his back with one hand. The moment he got close to the gray figure, he suddenly thrust it out. Dean's expression was indifferent as he raised his hand to grab the dagger. At the same time, he said to Richelieu, "Pope, if you don't want to face the power of the pioneers, then it's better not to make a sound. I don't want to kill you for the time being." His voice was gentle. At the same time, his palm was like lightning as he grabbed the gray figure's wrist. The gray figure shook his wrist and suddenly threw out the dagger. At the same time, his other palm suddenly slapped towards Dean's face. Dean's eyebrows slightly moved. He didn't expect this person to be so good. He was far better than the other senior hunters he had met. However, this instantaneous rapid change was still difficult to escape his eyes. He turned his wrist and fiercely shook off the gray figure's palm. At the same time, 2 fingers came together and stabbed out like a sword. Puff! The gray figure couldn't dodge and immediately froze on the spot. His throat had been pierced by Dean's 2 fingers. When he finished speaking, the battle also ended at the same time. His fingers touched the warm blood and tissues of the gray figure, and then he mercilessly hooked 2 fingers back and dug out the tissues deep in the throat. At the same time, he hit the chin with the back of his hand and overturned it. The gray figure's eyes were wide open, his bloodshot eyes filled with disbelief and shock. His body fell limply to the ground like a falling barrier, revealing Richelieu, who was standing behind him with a face full of shock. When Richelieu saw Dean, he wanted to shout for help. However, the word "pioneer" in Dean's words made him swallow his cry for help back down. If Dean used other words to threaten him, he would completely ignore it. However, the existence of pioneer was a high-level news in the inner wall. Almost no one in the outer wall knew about it. Even the name of the existence above the hunters was rarely known, let alone the top pioneer. The weight of these 3 words in his heart had already penetrated deep into his bone marrow. Just like when civilians heard nobles, they would subconsciously lower their voice. This was the awe and fear branded by the long-term rule. When he reacted, he saw the gray figure had already fallen. The smell of blood filled the hall. He stared at Dean in a daze. It was hard for him to believe that this terrifying teenager was the genius who came from a civilian background and had no background. Dean saw that Richelieu didn't shout. He indifferently said, "You are quite smart." Richelieu came back to his senses and his face darkened. He stared at Yi Futien and at the same time, noticed the slender figure behind Yi Futien who was wearing a veil. His instincts told him that this silent slender figure was even more dangerous. "What do you want to do? If I remember correctly, I don't seem to have offended you. Do you want to kill me and become the Pope yourself?" Richelieu narrowed his eyes. Dean shook off the sticky blood on his fingers. I want to be the Pope. I don't need to kill you. But the premise is that you have to cooperate with me. There was a trace of cold light in the depths of Richelieu's eyes. His wrinkled face was gloomy. Since things have come to this, why don't you take off the mask and we will talk, Mr. Dean? All right. Dean raised his hand and pinched his face. He quickly pulled out a layer of thin film and revealed his original appearance. He didn't care about his appearance being exposed. Since the Pope knows about the Dark Church, then you should be able to guess the purpose of me coming here to find you, right? Richelieu's face was gloomy. If I'm not wrong, you are really crazy. Do you know what you are doing? You want to control the Dark Church and control the underground forces of the outer wall. I believe that it won't take long for the monastery to get the news. They will send the strong to suppress you. Even if you have the support of the pioneers, you can't beat the monastery. He had some guesses when Dean said the words pioneers. With Dean's original physique, he had such a powerful strength in just a few months. It wasn't strange that he had the support of the pioneers. The only strange thing was, why did the pioneers do this? Did they want to use him as a chess piece to declare war on the monastery? Thoughts were surging in his mind. He was speculating a lot of information. If my enemies are like you, I think I will be very touched if they are in danger and can warmly consider for me. Dean's expression was calm as he glanced around. He took Aisha to a chair and sat down. Since you are so enthusiastic, how about passing your position to me? Richelieu saw that Dean was fearless, and he was secretly shocked. His face sank when he heard Dean's words. My position? Don't tell me that you don't just want the Dark Church but also want to be the Pope? What's the difference? Dean asked back. Richelieu choked back his anger and said, I advise you not to let your imagination run wild. The position of pontiff is not something that I can pass to anyone I want. Even if I am willing to pass it to you, with your status and your history, how can you be worthy of the position? The Church won't obey you. The elders won't obey you, civilians and nobles won't obey you. Not everyone can sit in the position of the Pope. I know. Dean indifferently said, so I have another candidate. This person is from the Holy Church. You just need to pass it to him. Richelieu was surprised. Who? Are you willing to give up the position? Dean didn't answer. Richelieu's face turned ugly. He didn't think that there would be a spy under his nose. Moreover, the spy was bought by an unknown kid with no background. It was a shame. He took a deep breath. Can you tell me why you are doing this? Is it because you were wronged and imprisoned? Is it because you want to retaliate against everyone? I think I am overestimating you by saying that I am retaliating, Dean said. I am just doing what I want to do. As for hatred, you don't deserve it. Richelieu sighed softly and said, when the mystic sect sent you here to be the 9th District Elder, I saw your identity information. I know that you have suffered a lot along the way. However, the God of Light has been watching over you to be where you are today. The God of Light will repay all the injustice you have suffered. You are still young. Do not let your eyes be blinded by hatred. Hatred will drag you into the abyss of sin. Hatred will only make people suffer and blind. His voice was full of compassion. The moment you let go of hatred is the moment you embrace the light. You will see that the world isn't as dirty as you imagined. Darkness will blind people, and they won't be able to see the future. You only need to let go of the hatred and you will be free. Dean quietly looked at him. In addition to the darkness, there is also strong light that blinds people. Do you think it is possible to use this trick on other fools? But do you think it is possible to use it on me? Richelieu was startled. You have sunk too deep. If everyone in the world is like you and is dominated by hatred, then the world will be destroyed. Do you think that a world dominated by killing can last long? Everyone will suffer setbacks, but when they encounter setbacks, they will hate the world. In the end, they will only destroy themselves. Even if you don't believe in God, you should at least believe in one truth. A world of love and peace is the most perfect world, right? Is that so? Dean asked. Richelieu stared at him. Isn't it? No. Dean calmly looked at him. Have you heard of a story? Richelieu was startled. Story? Once upon a time, there was a farmer who built a sheep pen filled with snow-white lambs. Dean slowly said, Every lamb is happy and happy. Although they fight for food, but there are no casualties. So every lamb can eat delicious food. The farmer was happy to see such a situation. But as the days passed, the lambs in the sheepfold grew bigger and fatter. The gentle farmer finally picked up the knife and slaughtered the lambs one by one and sold them to the meat market. The happy lambs didn't know what real fear was until that day came. Richelieu slowly frowned as he listened to Dean's narration. Then, in the second year, the farmer bought a group of lambs. Dean continued. The lambs lived happily in the pen, but one day the wolf came. The wolf rushed into the pen, and all the lambs were frightened. They desperately ran out of the pen to hide. When the farmer heard the news, he rushed to the pen and saw that several lambs were killed. The rest were scared and ran away. He was exasperated and hated the wolf. And those lambs that ran away also hated this wolf, because this wolf caused them to lose a stable home. Dean looked up at him and said, Do you hate this wolf? Richelieu's face was gloomy. He knew that Dean was asking him to make a choice. It wasn't a choice of hate but a choice of position. He was silent for a long time before he said, Have you ever thought that even if the lambs knew their final fate, they would still hate the wolf? Dean looked at him with interest. Richelieu replied, Because in this pen, they can at least live a peaceful life until they grow old. But once they leave the pen, they will be in a precarious situation. Who knows when they might die of sickness or starvation? Compared to such a life, living in the pen is the greatest happiness, isn't it? Dean nodded slightly. You are right. The ending of the story is like this. In the end, the farmer killed the wolf and found the lambs. This is a happy story. Richelieu slightly opened his mouth. No one knew what he was going to say. But Dean's tone was gentle. We are people, not lambs. There is a big difference between people and lambs. People have dignity. Of course, there are many people who don't have dignity. But at least some people have dignity. They don't want to be lambs. So in real life, not everyone will hate the wolf. Dean looked at him. The existence of the dark church is like this, isn't it? Richelieu's lips slightly moved. He sighed. You are right, but it is because of this that it is sad. You also think it is sad. What I said is sad is not that some people are willing to be lambs. Richelieu shook his head and sighed. Those who think that they can see the world outside the pen and predict the behavior of the farmer are smart lambs. They know their end, so they don't want to live in peace. They like to stir up trouble. But they are just sheep. Even if they are angry, violent, what can they do? They will only hurt their own kind. They can't hurt even a hair of the farmer. So the smarter the person is, the more dangerous they are. The more rational they are, the more cold-blooded they are. When dealing with smart people, don't open your heart. Dean slowly nodded. You are right. The world is in the hands of smart people. It will also be destroyed in the hands of smart people. But if you don't want to be destroyed, you have to be that smart person. Richelieu said, Your idea is no different from those smart lambs. Dean was silent. After a long time, he slowly said, If I accept my fate, there will be no hope. If I don't try, how do I know that my horn won't pierce the farmer's neck? Richelieu deeply looked at him. But have you ever thought about how many of your kind will be hurt by your attempt? There are only two kinds of people in the world. Those who accept their fate are one kind, and those who don't accept their fate are the other. Dean looked at him coldly. On the chessboard, every chess piece has the role of killing the enemy. In that case, you should be prepared to be killed. You are completely blinded by the darkness. Richelieu sighed. Hatred will only lead to destruction. Your current behavior is like this. Even if you get the ruling power of the Dark Church and the Holy Church, what can you do? You have broken the stable order of the monastery in the outer wall. You have also broken the rules of the inner wall. Do you know how serious the consequences of breaking the rules are? You are rebelling against all the people of the giant wall of Sylvia. Chapter 6:19. Richelieu whispered, "What you said makes sense. But have you ever thought about how many people lost their lives because of you when you broke the rules? Don't you feel guilty? They are all ordinary people like you, just like you in the past, but now they have lost their lives because of the current you." "You should say this to the people above you," Dean said. "Don't they preach universal love? In that case, I am willing to exchange positions with them." "You..." Richelieu choked and couldn't speak. Dean said, "Tell me, which path do you want to choose?" Richelieu stared at him and said, "Before I make my choice, can we have a good talk?" "Yes." Dean didn't think much. Richelieu was relieved. It seemed that he was still a teenager and didn't have much experience. However, this gave him an opportunity. Since you have made up your mind and don't care about other people's lives, then you should care about your own life, right? Even if you get the position of Pope and control the Dark Church, I guess your next step will be to break the military of the outer wall and the magistrate. Is your purpose to rule the outer wall? Richelieu narrowed his eyes and stared into Dean's eyes. Dean didn't dodge. Yes. Richelieu was startled as he saw Dean admit it so easily. But what shocked him more was that his guess was actually true. This teenager was planning to control the entire outer wall. Richelieu calmed down. You have been in contact with the monastery. You have the support of pioneers, so you should know what kind of power the inner wall has. In their eyes, the outer wall is just an abandoned place. It's not worth mentioning. I know, Dean calmly said. To put it simply, the gap between the outer wall and the inner wall is like the gap between the commercial district and the slums. I remember that the rich people in the commercial district call the slums garbage dump. The outer wall is the same in the eyes of the inner wall. Since you know, don't forget where I came from. Dean interrupted him. I come from the junkyard, but I used to make all the rich people in the commercial district look up to me. All the rich people wanted to have a relationship with the aristocracy and respect me. I have broken the wall between the slums and the commercial district. Now I can break the wall that separates the inner wall and the outer wall. Richelieu was stunned. He suddenly thought of the incredible miracles that this young man had created, and he also thought of this young man's background. He was a lowly commoner, and he was even an abandoned child. But it was this person who lived in the dirt that stood in front of him, standing above the clouds. The facts were in front of him, and he couldn't deny it. After a moment, he thought of a new wording and slowly said, I know you are very good, but your behavior this time is too reckless. It's like you are still in the slums, and you don't have any noble status in the commercial district. But you want to gather all the poor people to oppose the rich nobles in the commercial district. What do you think the outcome will be? You're right, Dean calmly said. But what if the power of the poor people can destroy the army in the commercial district? What do you think the outcome will be? Richelieu was stunned when he heard the last sentence. He woke up the next moment. There was a trace of surprise in his eyes. Could it be that there was more than one pioneer behind the teenager? Was there a big force in the inner wall who was ready to go to war with the monastery? He felt a sense of crisis as he thought of this. You should feel lucky. Lucky? Richelieu frowned. Dean said, I usually use my hands more than my mouth. But tonight I didn't kill you nor did I forcibly enslave you. Can you guess the reason why I talked with you? Richelieu's expression changed slightly as he stared at him and said, Because you know that if you kill me, you will not be able to obtain the position of Pope. The elders of the Church will immediately recommend a new Pope, and they will recommend him according to his seniority, contribution, reputation, and so on. The person who is your spy might not have an advantage in these conditions, So you have to keep me alive so that I can give up my position to him. Dean didn't deny nor agree. What else? You want to get some information from me? Richelieu narrowed his eyes. It's about the monastery. So you are not in a hurry to kill me? Dean nodded slightly. That's right. Richelieu's heart shivered. Didn't Dean's words mean that he denied the first point he said? If it was denied, then it meant that the person who was Dudien's reputation and contribution in the Holy Church wasn't as high as he had guessed? Thinking of this, several names emerged in his mind, but at the same time, another idea emerged. Perhaps this was Dean's smokescreen. He couldn't be so easily alienated by him. Anything else? Dudien continued. Richelieu raised his eyebrows. Anything else? Dean shook his head. It seems that you are really old. Richelieu's face sank. Can you be direct? Dean raised a finger. The main reason is that I need your loyalty. Loyalty? Richelieu was taken aback. He looked at him in disbelief and said, You want me to pledge my loyalty to you? Yes, submit to me and be loyal to me. Richelieu thought that Dean meant abdication and didn't want to fight against him. He didn't expect that the boy wanted to take him under his command. He wanted the dignified leader of 2 churches to be loyal to a kid who was less than 20 years old. You don't deserve me to be loyal to you. Richelieu's face was gloomy. I can consider it if you just want the position of pontiff. But you want me to be loyal to you? It's wishful thinking. You can be the dog of the monastery, so why can't you be my dog? Dean looked at him as if it was a matter of course. Richelieu's expression darkened. Even if the mystic sect treats me well, they wouldn't dare to be so impudent. Don't think that you are holding me hostage. I don't want to expose my strength, but you have really angered me. At this point, his slightly hunched back slightly straightened, and a creaking sound came from his spine. His whole body exuded a strong aura. It was as if he was no longer the gentle old man draped in the gorgeous robes of the Pope, but the king of massacre who held blood in his hands. Dean's expression was very calm. Of course I know. As the chairman of the Dark Church, how can you suppress those little rascals who don't abide by the law? If I'm not wrong, then you should have reached the limit of a senior limitless. You should be stronger than what the monastery had expected. Richelieu was surprised. He didn't expect Dean to see through his cards. It was obvious that the boy had a strong perception. He snorted in his heart. The stronger the perception, the weaker Dean's fighting ability. The previous attack was estimated to be the strongest power Dean could muster. Since you know, then I can't let you live. Richelieu was ready to step out. Dean suddenly said, Wait a minute. Richelieu looked at him coldly. Beg for mercy? Or, don't talk. Let me think. Dean interrupted him. He frowned and muttered to himself while counting his fingers, the limit of a high-level frontiersman. There should be a gap between him and a pioneer. He shouldn't be killed directly in one move. Speaking of this, he frowned slightly. Richelieu thought that Dean would say something. But when he heard Dean talking to himself, he was angry and a little scared because Dean's attitude was too calm. He couldn't see the slightest bit of bravado. But it was absolutely impossible to say that there was someone here who could kill him in one move. First of all, he was very sure that Dean's strength was not that of a pioneer. After all, even a big force like the Inner Wall could cultivate a large number of hunters and even limitless, but to cultivate a pioneer was not something that could be done overnight. The masked woman next to him was even more unlikely. If she was the pioneer behind Dean, then it was not Dean's turn to talk to him. And from the woman's position and posture, it seemed that she was just a servant. Most importantly, Dean had held her hand. If there was no particularly close relationship, how could a pioneer allow others to touch her? He thought for a moment, but finally eliminated the distracting thoughts. He didn't say another word and suddenly made a move. When it was time to make a move, he never talked nonsense. Whoosh! His figure suddenly swept out, like a gorgeous golden light hitting Dean. At the same time, Dean had already raised his palm, the bell on his wrist shaking slightly. Chapter 6:20. A sudden gust of wind blew in the main hall, causing the curtains to flutter violently. A bolt of purple lightning suddenly appeared and collided with the golden light. With a loud bang, the golden light dissipated and revealed Richelieu's figure. His face was filled with shock. Two fair, slender arms were wrapped around his shoulders. Their sharp fingernails pierced deep into his luxurious robe that was embroidered with golden threads, holding his arms in place. The powerful force of the arms pushed his body backwards at a rapid speed. With a bang, Richelieu's body hit the metal pillar on the edge of the bed. The entire pillar was dented, and his back was pressed hard against it. He was completely suppressed. Roar! A low growl that sounded like that of a ferocious beast came right at him. Richelieu could only see a pair of pure black eyes closing in on him, filled with a menacing coldness. It was as if he would be swallowed by an unknown force the very next moment. No! His mind instantly fell into despair. He could only watch in horror. Everything happened too quickly, and he was caught off guard. He had no time to react. Ding-dong! There was a faint sound of a metal bell. The terrifying oppressive aura stopped abruptly, and everything returned to normal. Only the stinging pain from his shoulder woke Richelieu up instantly. His first reaction was to attack immediately, and use all his strength to repel the shadow in front of him. But when he raised his arm slightly, he felt an indescribable pain coming from his arm. It was as if he had a cramp, and the pain was so intense that he instantly lost consciousness. His raised arm immediately froze. The pain made his eyes reveal a trace of unbearable agony. It wasn't that he couldn't endure pain, but the pain in his arm was completely beyond what he could bear. It was 10 times more intense than when his arm was cut off. Ding-dong! The metal bell rang again, but it was different from the previous bell. This time it shook a few times. With a whoosh, Richelieu felt a strong wind roll up in front of him. His body relaxed, and the pain in his shoulder instantly reduced. At the same time, the mysterious woman who was holding him back also withdrew. The speed of her departure was so fast that he could not see her clearly. It was as if she had taken away all the warmth from his body, and he felt an indescribable chill and palpitation. When he eagerly looked over, he saw that the mysterious woman had returned to Dean's side. She was still the same as before, like a servant or a close friend. She quietly stood beside the teenager without making any sound. It seemed that she had been standing there from beginning to end and had not moved at all. Richelieu's arm had already returned to normal. That strange, twisted pain had also returned to normal, so much so that he did not feel any pain at all. He looked at this young man with a face full of shock, as well as the mysterious woman beside him. The shock in his heart had reached an extreme level. He could never have imagined that this woman, who had not made a single sound like an assassin, would actually possess such terrifying power. With just one move, he was completely suppressed. Furthermore, if she had not retreated in time, he felt that he might have already died. This was a power that completely surpassed his, and it was far beyond his imagination. Just the most basic speed and strength made him unable to react or resist. "Mr. Speaker, can we have a good talk now?" Dean indifferently looked at him. Richelieu gradually recovered as he heard Dean's words. There was a trace of complex emotions in his eyes. The main reason why he was not in a hurry to call for help was that he was confident that he could deal with Dean with his own strength. After all, if he couldn't defeat an opponent, then there was no one in the entire outer wall who could. However, the brief exchange of blows just now had crushed all the confidence in his heart. "You have such a strong power. What else is there to talk about?" Richelieu slightly clenched his fist as he spoke in a bitter tone. Dean indifferently said, "I'm not like you. You are a respectable person. I can give you an equal opportunity to communicate with me." Richelieu was taken aback. He raised his head and looked at the young man. Seeing his calm expression, he suddenly felt an indescribable feeling. He smiled bitterly and said, "You can totally defeat me and force me to do whatever you want. Why bother saying so much to me?" Dean looked at him. If it was someone else asking this question, then it would be excusable. But isn't it a bit strange for the Pope to ask this question? Richelieu was stunned for a moment but soon realized the meaning behind Dean's words. He suddenly understood why Dean was talking so much. He couldn't help but have a strange feeling in his heart. "Do you really want me to be loyal to you? Are you not willing?" Dean looked at him and quietly said, "Fighting can only convince people, but using words can convince people. Since ancient times, the power of words is often better than thousands of knives and swords. Unfortunately, all verbal communication needs to be based on the situation of equal fists. It's like a hot knife theory." Richelieu's heart shook. He had to say that Dean's words were very reasonable. At least at his age he wouldn't be able to say such words. In addition to the strength of the boy, what was more terrifying was his heart and his wisdom. "You are really smart." After a moment of silence, he slowly said, "It seems that all of us have underestimated you in the past. A person who possesses power but only knows how to use it to subdue others is ultimately a boorish fellow. A person like you who possesses power but doesn't use it easily means that your understanding of power is deeper and further than ordinary people's. If this era was a little better, you would indeed be able to achieve something extraordinary." He spoke very seriously because these words were his true feelings. Dean calmly said, "You are flattering me. Since you look up to me, then it's time to make your choice. I hope you can make a smart choice." Richelieu was silent for a long time. "If I surrender to you, will you dare to use me? Aren't you afraid that I will pretend to surrender and then sell you out with false information?" "I have my own way," Dean indifferently said. Richelieu deeply looked at the boy. The boy's confidence made him feel a bit uncertain. At the same time, he felt a trace of jealousy and luck. He was jealous because the boy was so young but had a mind that didn't lose to him. Fortunately, such a person wasn't born in the same era as him. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to live a stable life as the Pope for so many years. "I don't seem to have a choice. I am willing to be loyal to you as long as you are willing to believe me." Richelieu narrowed his eyes. "Very good." Dean clapped his hands. There was still no trace of a smile on his face. He calmly said, "Smart people are always cute. Now I will give you the first task. Prepare to abdicate the position of Pope. I need you to hand over the position of Pope to my confidant within 7 days." Richelieu's heart sank. "You don't believe me?" "I believe you," Dean said. "I believe that you will listen to me." Richelieu was speechless. After a while he said, "What will I get if I follow your orders? Will you get rid of me after I abdicate the position?" "You look down on me too much," Dean said. "I won't betray anyone who is loyal to me as long as they don't betray me. That's my rule. Also, if I really want the position of the Pope, I can still get it even if I kill you now. I only need to subdue all the elders in the Council of Elders and let them vote for one person. I believe that even if the person they choose is a nameless novice, he will be able to ascend to the throne of the Pope in one step, and there will be no objections from the commoners. After all, any resume and deeds can be shaped. As long as there is a credible person to testify, then it is the best evidence, isn't it?" Richelieu's face slightly changed. He felt a trace of coldness in his heart. He knew that Dean was right. If he subdued the entire elder group, then the existence of the Pope would be equivalent to nothing. Moreover, with Dean's strength, it was entirely possible to achieve this, but it would be a bit troublesome. "You will follow me in the near future. My great cause will be completed and your position won't just be a little Pope in the outer wall. You will even be the dean of the monastery." Dean threw out the sweet fruit, "But I will have to inconvenience you for a while. I hope you can understand and cooperate with me." Richelieu's face changed. He knew that there was no turning back once he took this step. He couldn't help but feel sad and at a loss. Once upon a time he stood at the highest point and looked down upon the civilians and nobles of the outer wall. But now he was coerced and had no choice but to become a vassal. I know. Richelieu sighed in his heart. There was a trace of helplessness and vicissitudes in his voice. Dean said, "You can no longer live here during the period of abdication. I will take you to a new place where all your instructions will be conveyed to the Holy Church." Richelieu was startled. He immediately understood that Dean was guarding against his secret betrayal. Dean wanted to isolate him from contact with other members of the Holy Church. Obviously, this was what Dean meant when he said, "I have my own ways." "I know." Richelieu didn't say anything. Dean nodded. "Now you are going to leave a handwritten order. The content of the order is that you encountered an assassin tonight and are seriously injured. You need to concentrate on recuperating." Encountered an assassin? When Richelieu heard this, he felt that Dean was bold enough to report his whereabouts. But soon he noticed the corpse on the ground. His face slightly changed. The assassin that Dean was talking about was most likely him. In this way, he could explain the smell and corpse left behind when he died. At the same time, he could also lay the groundwork for the succession of the throne. Chapter 6:21. "I know." Richelieu agreed. Dean gestured for him to leave. Richelieu understood and went to the other side of the hall. He took out a scroll from the drawer and started to write. He picked up the scroll and handed it to Dean for a look. Dean glanced at it. The content was roughly the same as what he had told him. There shouldn't be any secret code hidden in the text. He nodded. "All right, get ready and leave with me." Seeing that things had come to this, Richelieu did not say anything more. He silently walked to the desk, opened the drawer, and took out some items, including a fine gold-plated goose-feather pen from the pen holder. Dean looked at the scattered things he packed and pointed to one of them. "What is this black box?" "It's the box that I used to store my knight badge when I was promoted to captain. I keep it with me as a souvenir," Richelieu said. Dean's eyes slowly swept through every item in the bag. There was an expensive quill, extremely white paper engraved with strange patterns, a badge engraved with strange patterns, a silver nail. There were all kinds of items. He looked at them one by one and quietly looked into Richelieu's eyes. "Do you really want to take these things away?" Richelieu had a bitter expression on his face as he said, "In the near future, I probably won't be coming back here again. Although these things don't have any practical use, they were once my most precious possessions. For example, this little nail. Once, when I was on a mission, I fell into a trap and was framed by my comrade. This nail was shot out by him with a hidden arrow, and it pierced my chest. Luckily, it missed by just a little, or else I would have died on the spot. So all these years, I've always kept this nail by my side, as a constant reminder to myself." Dean stared into his eyes. Richelieu also didn't avoid Dean's eyes. After a moment, Dean slowly withdrew his eyes and nodded. "Since you want to take them away, I will let you take them all." Richelieu looked relieved and sincerely said, "Thank you." Dean didn't say anything more. He turned around and took Aisha's hand. They went to the window and waited for Richelieu. Richelieu quickly tied the bag and followed Dean. The night was dark. Dean let Richelieu lead the way down the mountain. Under the guidance of Richelieu, the two avoided all the gaps of the guards and smoothly came to the foot of the mountain. They didn't disturb any guards along the way. The entire heavily guarded mountain was like an uninhabited place for the three of them to go in and out. Richelieu did not take the opportunity to call for help. When Dean asked him to lead the way, he knew that it was a test given to him by Dean. But such a small test was naturally not difficult for him. He also knew that even if he alerted the guards, it would be difficult to stop Dean. Instead, he would be killed immediately. Dean immediately took back the right to lead the way as he led Richelieu along the remote street. A few hours later, Dudien and Richelieu returned to the castle by the Teza River. Sergei, Glenn, Nicholas and others were shocked when they entered the castle. They didn't expect that the figure that they could only look at from afar would appear in such a close place. Dudien called Nicotine. "How is the plantation?" Nicholas looked at Richelieu, who was standing behind Dean. He responded, "Master, the cultivation base has returned to normal. All the workers have been appeased." "Is there a finished product?" Dudien asked. Nicholas said respectfully, "Yes, according to your orders, they are all stored in the warehouse." Dudien nodded. "Go and get some." Nicotine was a little surprised and wanted to ask, "Now?" "Yes, young master." After saying that, he turned around and quickly left, leading a fast horse and disappearing into the night. Richelieu frowned as he heard Dean's words. "What kind of base is it?" Dean called Noyce after Nicotine left. "Go to the 9th region and ask Hawkeye to get 2 sets of decomposition equipment. One set is for alchemists and the other set is for potioneers. I want the best." Noyce hesitated for a moment. "Yes, young master." He had participated in the operation to suppress the Dark Church in the 12th region. He estimated that he wouldn't be expelled or hunted down if he returned to the 9th region. Dudien asked Glenn to steal some materials from the market after Noyce left. He wrote a list of materials and gave it to her. Glenn's stealth ability and Black Weaver's magic mark ability were overkill for her to be a thief. Richelieu was puzzled as he looked at the orders issued by Dean. He felt an inexplicable crisis. It seemed that the youth was preparing for something big. Moreover, it had been a long time since the beginning. Even his plantation base. The hateful thing was that he didn't pay attention to the people around the youth. He didn't pay attention to his original subordinates after he was arrested in the inner wall. He was too careless. However, he couldn't be blamed for this. It wasn't that he didn't pay attention to Dean's subordinates for a period of time. However, Dean's subordinates were behaving very well. So he gradually relaxed his vigilance and didn't investigate further. After all, at that time, Dean had completely become a person under his control. As for his original men, they had long been insignificant characters, not worth mentioning. But who would have thought that in just a few short months, this young man had not only broken free from his control, but had even stepped on him? If he had been more vigilant towards this young man and thoroughly investigated the people around him, perhaps he would not have ended up like he did today. He shook his head and sighed. Dean glanced at Richelieu. "Has Mr. Mel woken up?" "He has woken up but still won't say anything," Sergei replied. Dean nodded. "Did the 2 little girls open their mouths?" "No. Their mouths are too hard. I separated them in front of them but they still won't open their mouth. They didn't even beg for mercy." Sergei smiled. Dean nodded. "It means that they haven't reached their bottom line. You don't have to be tender towards them." Sergei scratched his head. "I'm already very rough. I'm not talking about physical torture. Do you understand?" Dean said in a teaching tone. Sergei immediately understood. "I know. Go. I want to see them beg for mercy and lose all dignity," Dean said in a cold voice. Sergei nodded and went upstairs. Richelieu's face slightly changed as he heard Dean's words. He didn't expect that Dean was the one who massacred the Mel family. How much blood had this young boy's hands been stained with? His lips moved. "You have destroyed the Mel family. Why do you want to torture them?" "Really?" Dean glanced at him. Richelieu was startled. "If I remember correctly, there is a young master of the Mel family called Mel. He seems to be a knight of light from the Holy Church. He is very young and promising. He wasn't at home on the night of the incident. Afterwards he disappeared from the Holy Church. Do you have any trace of him?" Dudien indifferently asked. Richelieu shook his head. "I didn't pay attention to these things. But if you want to check, then I'll send a letter back, and I'll give you the answer." "No," Dean said. "The giant wall is big, but it's not as big as the world. It's not difficult to find a person. Chapter 622. Dean took Richelieu to his room. It will inevitably arouse suspicions. Tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock at Martha's Square in the Western District. Show your face to clear the suspicion of the Holy Church. I know. Richelieu nodded. How long do you think it will take for the inner wall to notice the movement here? Dean asked. Richelieu had expected that Dean would ask this question. He already had an answer in his heart, but he pretended to think about it. If I go to Martha's Square tomorrow, then I should be able to hide for a while. There are 5 supervisors in the Holy Church who are responsible for passing messages to the monastery. Although the frequency of transmission isn't much, but if they know that I'm injured or missing, then they will certainly report to the monastery. Dean said in a profound tone, You should have said this before. Richelieu pretended not to understand and continued, Even if I manage to hide it from the 5 Dean supervisors, when the news of me passing on the throne comes out in 7 days, they will definitely inform the mystic sect immediately. By then, the mystic sect will definitely know about the situation here and send people to stop me, because the passing on of the throne has always been decided by them. Hence, if it is possible, I feel that it is better to delay the passing of the throne. I am really not being selfish. I have already pledged my loyalty to you and stand on the same side as you. You letting me pass on the throne is just to make you feel more at ease, but the price is too high. It's too late. Dean said in an indifferent tone. The time of passing won't change. If it is to be changed, then it should be in advance and not delayed. Richelieu frowned. Why are you in such a hurry? If you delay it for half a month, then you will have more time to control the outer wall. Why are you so nervous? If you don't believe me, then I'll listen to you. Dean looked at him and calmly said, There is an old saying called speed is the most important thing in war. Since we are at war with the monastery, then we have to seize the opportunity. We have to cut off all the hands and feet of the enemy before they can react. Will they be able to resist? Richelieu was stunned for a moment. Although he hadn't heard of this word, but he could roughly understand it. Indeed, Dean's current situation was that if he could control the outer wall as fast as possible, then he would have more time to deal with the monastery. If he continued to delay, then the chaos inside and outside would be inevitable. Do you have any relatives? Dean asked casually as he touched the wood carving on the table. Richelieu smiled. How can I have any relatives when I sit in this position? It's lonely at the top. Dean nodded but didn't ask further. Seeing Dean's reaction, Richelieu was relieved. At this time, he heard Dean ask again, Tell me the names and residences of the 5 proctors. Richelieu's expression changed. Dean nodded as he saw that the quality was good. He took the things and asked Noyce to move the 2 decomposing equipment to his basement to start refining. More than an hour passed in the blink of an eye. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. It was close to 5 o'clock in the morning. There was a faint light coming from the sky. Dean came out of the basement and went back to the room upstairs. Richelieu was still lying on the ground. His gorgeous robe was in close contact with the carpet. Dean helped him up. He picked up the syringe and rubbed Richelieu's wrinkled neck. He injected the white powder into Richelieu's neck. After a while, he took out another syringe and injected the light green liquid into Richelieu's neck. He picked up the teacup from the table and poured the cold tea on Richelieu's face. Chapter 623. He hugged his stomach and vomited, but nothing came out. After a bout of dry heaving, he suddenly felt countless ants and insects crawling up his throat. It was as if countless insect legs were scratching his throat, itching unbearably. Cough, cough, cough. He could not help but cough. Under the violent coughing, he felt a burning pain in his chest. Moreover, the itch in his throat did not subside. Instead, it became more and more unbearable, making him want to scratch. What did you do to me? Richelieu gasped for breath and raised his red face to look at Dudien. But he saw that the boy was staring at him with a chilling gaze. I didn't do anything. I just let you eat something delicious. Dean quietly looked at him. His tone was extremely flat. Richelieu's face changed. He was incomparably angry. He gritted his teeth and said, "Why are you doing this to me? Didn't you say that you completely trust me? I didn't betray you. I also hope that I can completely trust you. Unfortunately, you have disappointed me." Dudeen indifferently said, "You should have told me about the matter regarding the proctor. You should have waited until I brought you out. Otherwise, it would be tantamount to forcing me to solve them. Today I hope you can remember that any trouble you create for me will not give you a chance to escape." Richelieu's face turned ugly. "I didn't mean that. It was just that the situation was urgent and I didn't think about it. Moreover, you didn't ask." Dean waved his hand. "There is no need to explain. Whether you have such thoughts or not, this time is a warning to you. If you try to play tricks in the future, this punishment will last for the whole day." Richelieu was angry. His fingers slightly clenched and then slowly loosened. He suppressed the anger in his heart and was about to speak, but the strange itch in his throat was getting stronger and stronger. His lips could not help but tremble. With a low growl, he raised his hand and grabbed his throat, pressing his Adam's apple against his neck bone. The pressure and friction made the strange itch momentarily relieved. However, after a few seconds, the intense itch returned again, and it felt like it was spreading to his palm. He hurriedly let go of his hand. He was so itchy that he couldn't help but twist his head. Although his posture looked extremely strange, and with his previous image and dignity, he definitely wouldn't do such a self-destructive action, he couldn't care less at this moment. However, just twisting his neck could not completely suppress this strange itch. He could not help but raise his palm and pinch his throat again. He even had the urge to stab his fingers into his throat. "Ah!" he growled, breathing heavily. "The effect of this thing seems to be better than I expected. It seems that the radiation here is not completely useless." Dean looked at his unbearable appearance. He was both surprised and satisfied. He thought that he would have to inject a few more times to make him feel addicted. He didn't expect that just the first use would have such a great effect. All of this was obviously due to the soil of this era. The mulberry leaves and other addictive plant characteristics were much stronger than those of the old era. Richelieu desperately lowered his head and pressed his throat. He made a strange low growling sound. His wrinkled face was red and sweating profusely. Dudeen looked at the wall clock and quietly looked at the time. After a quarter of an hour, Richelieu finally couldn't bear it anymore. He panted and begged Dean, "Give me the antidote, please. I really didn't betray you, I really didn't." Dean looked at his pleading eyes. There was a trace of emotion in his heart. Even someone as strong as Richelieu couldn't resist this small plant. After a moment of silence, he slowly took out a small metal bottle from his pocket and said, "This is the antidote. Find a piece of paper, roll it up and light the paper with fire. Inhale the burning smoke, and you will be able to relieve the itch." Richelieu's reddened eyes looked at the small metal bottle in Dean's hand. He couldn't wait to snatch it. After hearing Dean's words, he didn't have any other thoughts. He immediately looked around and found a pile of books on the desk. He quickly rushed to the desk and grabbed one of the books that he had seen before. He opened the book and pulled out a few pages. Because he was too anxious, his trembling hands accidentally tore the paper into pieces. He was so anxious that he was sweating profusely. He pulled out 2 more pages and returned to Dean. He gasped, "Antidote!" Dean threw the metal bottle to him. Richelieu quickly took it and hurriedly opened the bottle. He poured out the contents of the bottle. It was a dark gray thing. It looked like smoked grass or ashes. He gasped as he poured these things on the paper. He quickly rolled it up according to Dean's instructions. After rolling it up, he suddenly thought of the lack of flame. He hurriedly looked around but didn't see the flint or the match that had recently replaced the flint. The flame lit up. Dean lit a match and handed it to him. He indifferently said, "I hope you can remember this lesson." Seeing the glimmer of the match, Richelieu had an excited feeling as if he had seen the dawn in the darkness. He even felt a trace of gratitude towards Dean. He completely ignored Dean's words and quickly handed the rolled paper to the match. He watched the match ignite the paper. The flame slowly burned along the pen-like paper. He had a feeling that he was about to be embraced by the light. Smoke floated from the roll of paper. He thought of Dean's words and tried to bite his own roll of paper and gently sucked it. A thick smoke was suddenly inhaled into his lungs. His tears almost flowed out. It was followed by a strong nausea and a violent cough. He coughed hard while patting his chest. He suddenly found that the strange itch on his throat had gradually disappeared. It was no longer so painful. It seems that there is really an antidote. He secretly heaved a sigh of relief in his heart. To prevent the detoxification from not being thorough enough, he took another breath. Once again, he choked and tears flowed out of his eyes. His chest felt like it was burning, but this burning pain was like heaven compared to the unbearable itch from before. Moreover, he slowly felt that his body was somewhat relaxed and became light as a feather. "Don't swallow it all. Use your throat to suck it and then spit it out," Dean instructed. Chapter 6:24. If I were you, I would leave a little bit of the antidote so that I won't make any more mistakes. Dean looked at him and said indifferently. Richelieu sobered up a little when he heard Dean's words, but the comfortable feeling of inhaling the antidote made him reluctant to stop. He inhaled again and gently exhaled. At this moment, he was proficient in expelling the excess smoke. He didn't choke to tears anymore. After exhaling, his whole body was so comfortable that he couldn't help but want to take another sip. He pinched the burning paper with his fingers, but there was still a faint smoke floating out. Looking at the smoke drifting away, he had a feeling of pity. He spat a few mouthfuls of saliva on it to completely extinguish the fire. Then he put it back into his robe pocket as if nothing had happened. Dean saw his little action and felt pity, but he didn't show it. He said, "It's getting late. You should rest first. I'll send someone to call you at 7 o'clock. You can sleep in my study room." Richelieu nodded. "I know." Dean immediately got up and left with Aisha. Richelieu was relieved after Dean left. He felt that he was a bit sad. His life was in the hands of others. He had no choice but to live in fear. He had lived a glorious life for most of his life, but he didn't expect that he would end up like this in his later years. He sighed and turned to sit on the chair that Dean had previously sat on. He looked up and scanned the study room. He didn't see anything strange. Dean let him sleep here because there was nothing valuable in the room, or it was hiding his secrets. He slowly retracted his gaze and was ready to lie down on the bed. Although he didn't plan to sleep, he still had to pretend that he had slept so as not to arouse Dean's suspicion. He was just about to get up when his toes touched something. He looked down and saw that it was a small metal bottle. It was exactly the same as the one that Dean had given him before. He was startled for a moment and his eyes lit up. He was about to pick it up when he suddenly thought of something. He looked up at the door and heard Dean's footsteps going downstairs. He was relieved and immediately bent down to pick up the small metal bottle. He opened it and saw that the antidote was exactly the same as before. "Is it a test? Or did you accidentally drop it?" His heart was anxious, but he quickly thought of something. "I'll keep it first. If he's testing me and asked me, then I'll give it to him. If he doesn't, then it means that he really dropped it." Thinking of this, he immediately put the small metal bottle into his robe, then turned to the bed, lifted the quilt, and lay down. He leaned against the bed and fell into deep thought. Dudyan came to the hall and said to Nicholas, "Tell Sergei to bring the two women." Nicholas nodded and immediately went upstairs. A moment later, Sarah and Sergei came downstairs together. The two women's hands were tied. Their hair was messy. Their clothes were torn, revealing their white bodies. There were many red marks on their shoulders. There were still tears on their faces. But at this moment, there was only hatred and resentment on their faces. They stared at Dean. "You hate me, but you can't kill me. Are you very angry?" Dudian looked at the two women. Sarah screamed and raised her hand to attack Dudian. However, Sergei held her down and slapped her face. She fell to the ground. Her messy hair covered her cheeks. "Since when did you not know how to show mercy to the fairer sex?" Dudian looked at Sergei. Sergei replied, "Master, didn't you tell me not to be polite to them? I'm not like this to other girls. I love women very much." Dudian handed him 2 syringes. There was a light green liquid inside. "Give them the antidote." Sergei curiously looked at the 2 syringes. He wanted to ask, but he saw Dudian's cold face. He held back his questions and took the syringes in front of the 2 women. "Dudian, you bastard!" Sarah screamed in anger. "I won't let you go even if I die. If you are a man, then kill me." Sergei pinched her throat and kicked Lisa's chest. Lisa was sent flying to the side. Sergei looked at Dudian. "Is it all right to fight our way in?" Sarah was like a chicken. Sergei looked at Dudian. "Is it all right?" Dudian rolled his eyes. "Of course it will be in the blood vessels." Sergei let out an "oh" sound and showed a malicious smile to Sarah. He stretched out his tongue and licked her shoulder. After seeing the blood vessels, he immediately inserted the syringe and slowly injected the light green liquid into her body. After the injection, he threw Sarah to the side and injected Lisa, who was trying to struggle with the injection. Dudian didn't inject the chemical addictive drugs that he had developed using the decomposition equipment for the 2 women. Through Richelieu's reaction, he found that the chemical addictive drugs were not as effective as the mulberry leaf. "Give them a tube of this every day." Dudian threw 2 small metal bottles to Sergei. "There are a lot of them in the basement. Go and get them yourself." Dudian explained how to use the bottles. Sergei couldn't help but be curious. "Master, what is this?" Dudian frowned as he saw Sergei's curious look. "Let's call this thing cigarette. I want to remind you that it is best not to touch it." Even though this familiar name was used, this thing was completely different from the olden era's cigarette. "Cigarette?" Sergei looked at the small bottle in his hand. He was curious, but he knew that the thing that Dudian gave to the 2 women was definitely not a good thing. Dudian didn't say anything but waved. "You can leave." The few of them nodded and left. Dudian and Nicholas were the only ones left in the empty hall. Dudian said, "You should also rest." Nicholas smiled. "Master, I'm a butler. How can I rest when you haven't rested?" Dudian waved his hand. "Let me be alone." Seeing the weariness on his face, Nicholas's eyes flashed, nodding. "I know." Finished speaking, he bowed his head and turned to leave. Dean rubbed his temples after he left. He raised his hand and pulled Aisha to sit next to him. He held her cold hands. He felt a trace of warmth in his heart. "Wait for me. I'll be able to avenge us soon." Aisha was indifferent and didn't speak. Chapter 6:25. The first rays of dawn shone on the clock tower of Martha Square. The soldiers on duty who had stayed up all night bathed in the morning light. Their bodies, which had been infected by the cold, slowly recovered some warmth and vitality. They sighed in relief, thinking that in another hour, it would be 7 o'clock when the shift would be over. At this time, the sound of hooves could be heard. A dozen knights clad in bright silver armor galloped over from the street outside the square. They rode all the way to the bell tower. A middle-aged knight at the front reined in the reins of his horse and said, "Soldiers on duty, listen up. The Pope will hold a prayer ceremony here in an hour. Sound the bell to inform everyone." The soldiers on duty were startled, but then they became happy and excited. They didn't expect the Pope to come here in person. This meant that they would be able to see this great man up close. This was an honor. Dong, 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 the melodious prayer bell rang. Unlike the normal morning bell, the prayer bell needed to be rung 18 times in a row. The ringing of the bell came from outside the square, and the nearby residents immediately woke up from their sleep. Hearing the continuous ringing of the bell, some of the older people did not count them one by one. Judging from the duration of the ringing of the bell, they immediately woke up their wives and children, and prepared to go to the square early to grab a good position in the front. The prayer ceremony was different from the prayer festival. The prayer ceremony could be held at any time, but only the elders of the Radiant Church were qualified to hold it. It was usually held during the black snow season and when there were frequent rains. It was to pray to the heavens and the gods to prevent plagues and disasters. For ordinary people, being able to benefit from the prayer ceremony was something they couldn't ask for more. As the bell rang, the Knights of the Radiant Church used carriages to drag wood and shelves to the square to build the prayer altar. These wood and shelves were all finished products and only needed to be assembled. As time passed, more and more people gathered in the square. In the blink of an eye, the square was filled with people. "Lord Bishop, it's almost time," a young Grand Knight with a gold star on his shoulder said with his head bowed. His eyes swept across the sea of people below the altar and said in a low voice, "Wait a little longer. The Pope has always been punctual." "Yes." The young Grand Knight nodded respectfully. At this moment there was a sudden commotion outside the square, followed by excited exclamations. Hearing the commotion, Elnarin immediately looked over and heaved a sigh of relief. He saw an elderly figure dressed in a luxurious golden robe slowly walking over, holding an ancient vine scepter that symbolized authority and honor. It was Pope Richelieu. Behind him, there were two Knights of Light. One of them had a head full of elegant blonde hair, and was obviously of noble birth. The other one, on the other hand, had black hair, was about 30 years old, and had a mediocre appearance. The Knights of Light stationed outside the square immediately stepped forward to protect the Pope. The crowd looked at the Pope in awe, especially those who were closest to him. They were so excited that they wanted to jump up and down on the spot, but they did not have the slightest thought of rushing over to hug him. The majesty brought by the robe and the scepter made people not dare to blaspheme him. "It's actually the Pope. The one holding the prayer ceremony is the Pope. My God, I saw the Pope. The Pope is too benevolent. He actually came to preside over the blessing ceremony himself." Excited cries could be heard from the crowd. As the crowd parted, Richelieu led his two attendants to the altar. "Greetings, Pope." Elnarin immediately bowed respectfully. The young Grand Knight beside him also bowed respectfully. Looking at his most trusted confidant, Richelieu nodded slightly and said, "How much longer?" Elnarin replied respectfully, "Pope, there are still 5 minutes left. Looks like I'm not late." Richelieu smiled slightly. "Is everything prepared?" "The prayers and the Holy Book. Everything is prepared." Elnarin's face was full of respect. He raised his head and glanced at Richelieu. His gaze quickly scanned the latter's body, but he did not see any signs of injury. He heaved a sigh of relief and said softly, "Pope, I have already seen the handwritten decree you left behind. I wonder, we'll talk about this later." Richelieu raised his hand and interrupted him. Elnarin reacted and immediately nodded. He raised his head and straightened his back. He looked at the square in front of him and waited for the countdown. 5 minutes was neither long nor short. In the process of waiting, Elnarin suddenly noticed the two Knights of Radiance beside the Pope. Their faces seemed a little unfamiliar, and there was even a black-haired man among them. That kind of hair color usually indicated that he was a slave or a commoner. He did not expect that he would be able to blend in with Richelieu. He looked at them for a while, but did not see anything strange. He moved his eyes to the bell tower next to him. The huge mechanical clock hanging on the bell tower slowly counted down. Finally, it was 7 o'clock. The bell rang, and the blessing ceremony officially began. Richelieu received the blessings and holy book from Elnarin. With a solemn expression, he began to read out the solemn opening speech, followed by the blessings. The blessings were not just a few simple sentences, but an extremely long prayer, taken from the Bible. Dean stood behind Richelieu and silently looked at the square in front of him. When the prayers were finished, everyone entered the prayer stage with Richelieu. They put their hands together and had a pious expression. Half an hour later, the blessing ceremony finally ended. Richelieu looked at Elnarin. "Tell the others to disperse. Come with me." "Yes." Elnarin noticed the change in Dean's expression and solemnly replied. Richelieu took Elnarin to a nearby tavern. He ordered several knights to clean up the tavern and stand guard outside. Then he brought Elnarin, Dean and Noyce into the tavern. Elnarin frowned as he saw the two attendants come in. "You two go out first. I have something to discuss with the Pope." Richelieu waved his hand. "It's all right. They are trustworthy." Ernelin was slightly startled, and he couldn't help but look at the two knights. Richelieu coughed softly and said coldly, "Someone in the church wanted to assassinate me. Fortunately, they did not succeed. However, as we do not know who the mastermind is, I cannot return to the church. So, for the time being, you will be in charge of all the matters in the church." Elnarin eagerly asked, "Are you really okay?" Richelieu shook his head. "It's not a big deal." Elnarin said, "The Holy Church is the safest place. Wouldn't it be more dangerous if you were outside? I'll send more people to protect you. Let the King of Light personally protect you." Richelieu waved his hand. "I don't know if the assassin is related to the King of Light or not." Elnarin was stunned, momentarily speechless. He suddenly felt a chill. Clenching his fists, he gritted his teeth and said, "If I get my hands on that person, I'll definitely teach him a lesson." Richelieu patted his shoulder. "If you have the opportunity, then help me pay attention." "I will." Elnarin looked solemn. He suddenly thought of something. "I'll send a few of my confidants to protect you. Otherwise, if you are outside, no need. They are enough to protect me." Richelieu waved his hand. Ernelin could not help but look at the two attendants again. His eyes were filled with a hint of solemnity and jealousy. He knew that Richelieu did not completely trust him, but he trusted the two of them completely. Otherwise, he would not have handed himself over to them for protection at this critical juncture. "I'm leaving. You have to protect yourself," Richelieu said in a profound tone. Elnarin felt that Richelieu wanted to tell him something. He thought that Richelieu wanted to remind him not to get assassinated by the culprit. Richelieu took off his gorgeous robe and took a simple coat from Dean. He put on a hood to cover his face and turned to leave the pub. He took Dean and Noyce along the street. They went around 7 or 8 streets and turned to the suburbs before returning to the castle by the Meuse River. "How was it? Did I perform well?" Richelieu took off his hood after entering the castle. He turned to Dudien. "I've told you everything you wanted me to say." Dudien indifferently said, "Not bad." She didn't pay attention to him as she quickly jumped up the stairs and came to her room. Her heart settled down when she saw Aisha sitting on the bed. He took Aisha's hand and left the room. They went back to the hall. Richelieu asked, "What are you going to do next? Do you have eyes and ears in the dark church?" Dudien looked at him. Richelieu was startled. There was a trace of hesitation in his heart. But he thought that he had to provide some eyes and ears to gain Dean's trust. "There are 2 of them. One is an elder of the 9th region. I sent him to the Dark Church. The other one is a subordinate of the Sword King. His name is Riley. He used to be the most outstanding genius swordsman of the Holy Church." Dean's eyes slightly moved as he glanced at him. "You are willing to send the best one to be a spy." Chapter 6:26. It should be because he is too outstanding and you are worried that you can't control him. Dudien's face was indifferent, but there was a deep meaning in his words. It's a good thing that the weapon is sharp, but if you are worried that you can't control it and try to destroy it to avoid being used by others, then it's sad and incompetent. What do you think? You are right. I didn't think that you would know more than me at such a young age. Richelieu modestly smiled and took the opportunity to compliment Dean. Anyway, compliments were free and would bring benefits to oneself whether the other party was a friend or an enemy. Dudien frowned as he saw Richelieu's humble attitude. He took out a small iron bottle from his pocket. This is sleeping medicine. I'm going out for a while. Take the medicine and have a good rest here. Wait for me to come back. Richelieu looked at the small black iron bottle in Dudien's hand and reluctantly smiled. I'm completely loyal to you. I will never betray you. Moreover, we are standing on the same boat. If I betray you, then it's tantamount to a dead end. I can't go back to the monastery. If you are worried, then you can send someone to monitor me. No one here is stronger than you. Dudien indifferently said, You are right. If you are really a smart person, then you shouldn't betray me because you will die. But I can't bet my life on someone who I don't even know if he's really smart or really stupid. Do you understand? Richelieu was speechless. Well, I'll eat. Dudien took the small iron bottle and unscrewed it. He poured out 2 black pills. The pills exuded a strange fragrance. He looked at them and threw them into his mouth. Not enough, Dudien said. Although this is made by a great potion master, and only one of them can make a senior hunter faint. But your physique is much higher, so you don't have to be polite with this bottle. Richelieu's mouth slightly twitched as he saw Dudien's eyes. He knew that it was useless to say more. He immediately poured the whole bottle into his mouth and slowly swallowed. At the same time he hid some of the pills in his mouth. He hoped that the part he swallowed wouldn't make him fall asleep. Very quickly, drowsiness crept over him. Richelieu sighed in his heart and pretended to be extremely tired. He turned around and walked to the sofa. With a tilt of his body, he collapsed onto the sofa. Very quickly, he began to snore softly. That's fast, Nicotine exclaimed beside him. Dean glanced at Richelieu's feet and indifferently said, I'm pretending to be asleep. Go and get the things from my basement. Pretending to be asleep? He turned around and saw Richelieu's body lying on the sofa. Although he was fast asleep, but his posture was very close to the sofa. His feet were very close to the sofa. How could a person who was tired to the point of falling down think about his sleeping posture? Thinking of this, he looked at Richelieu, who was still pretending to be asleep on the sofa, and a strange expression appeared on his face. He did not expect the great Pope to have such an embarrassing moment. At the same time, he admired Dean. If it was him, he would never be able to see that the Pope was pretending to be asleep. He didn't even think that such a legendary figure would be able to pretend to be asleep. What are you doing? Dean frowned. Nicotine quickly replied, Yes. He quickly walked to the basement and came back with a few syringes in his hand. Dean grabbed one of the syringes. There was a light green liquid inside. It was the liquid form of mulberry leaf. This liquid form was different from the cigarettes that were made from hay. First of all, it was fast and effective. It was directly injected into the blood. Unless the person had magic marks that could control the blood, it would be difficult to get rid of the mulberry leaves in the blood. However, the cigarettes made from hay needed to be inhaled in order to accumulate a certain amount in the blood. The effect was slow, but the advantage was that it was fast and convenient to make. Moreover, the residue of the liquid form could be disposed without waste. For people who were already addicted, the effect of the cigarettes made from hay was better. It was like a bomb primer that could directly detonate the strong desire in their blood. Dean grabbed Richelieu's arm and pinched it. Soon he saw the protruding meridians. He aimed at the meridians and injected it into the meridians. It depends on your performance whether you are pretending to be asleep or not. Richelieu was shocked when he heard Dean say, pretending to be asleep. At the moment, he peeked at the thing that Dean injected into him. His heart turned cold. He didn't expect this kid to be so hateful and capricious. Soon, the unbearable but pleasant itch slowly climbed out of his body. This time it was more intense than the last time. It spread from the internal organs to the whole body. It seemed that all parts of his body were being bitten by countless insects. It was unbearable. He tried to endure, but his body was trembling uncontrollably. He knew that he could no longer hide it. He simply sat up and kept scratching his arms and neck. He begged Dean, "I was wrong. Please give me the antidote. I know I was wrong." "You are really not smart." Dean shook his head slightly. Richelieu didn't care about Dean's ridicule. He wanted to peel off his skin. His eyes were red as he pulled Dean's arm. "Please give me the antidote. I beg you. If you are willing to kneel down and show complete surrender, then I can consider it," Dean indifferently said. Nicholas' eyelids twitched as he heard Dean's words. "Pope kneel down?" Richelieu's body stiffened as he looked up at Dean in disbelief. However, he saw that the teenager's expression was as cold and indifferent as ice. His heart was filled with anger. He released Dean's hand, lowered his head, and gritted his teeth. Time ticked by. Richelieu felt that the itch was getting stronger and stronger. On the contrary, the previous strong humiliation and anger were getting weaker and weaker. In the end, only the itch was left in his mind. He couldn't help but reach out and scratch his body again. His nails soon broke his skin, but he didn't feel any pain. Instead, he felt a comfortable feeling. He kept scratching. Very quickly, he felt something wet and sticky on his fingers. When he looked down, he was shocked to see that his arm was covered in bloody scars. Some places had been scratched very deeply and were badly mangled. However, he didn't feel the slightest bit of pain. "I will scratch myself to death if I continue like this." He immediately stopped, but the itch was getting stronger. It was as if his whole heart was being bitten by insects. He couldn't help but shrink into a ball. It seemed that this could slow down the feeling. "I'll give you 3 more minutes to think about it," Dean's voice sounded. Richelieu was lying on the bright red carpet next to the sofa. He looked up and saw Dean standing a few meters away. There was an expensive cigarette in his hand. The end of the cigarette was lit and he was gently smoking it. The smoke was inhaled and exhaled from his mouth. It made him look a bit vague. The cigarette that Dean was smoking was not made from mulberry leaf. It was similar to the cigarettes of the old era. It was less harmful, less addictive, and easy to quit. Seeing Dean sucking the cigarette, Richelieu instantly felt as if there were countless insects crawling on his throat. The itch was unbearable. He couldn't help but want to scratch his throat. But thinking of the shocking blood on his arm, he held back. He hammered the ground and growled in a low voice. At this moment, he had no time to think about why Dean was not poisoned but was smoking the antidote. Last minute. Dean took out a mulberry leaf cigarette from his pocket and rolled it on the toilet paper. He walked in front of Richelieu and his fingers loosened. The cigarette fell to the ground. Richelieu saw the cigarette fall to the ground. His eyes widened and he quickly reached out to pick it up. Before his palm could touch the cigarette, a leather shoe stepped on the cigarette. The shoe twisted slightly and flattened the cigarette. Then it slowly moved away. Richelieu looked at the scene in a daze. Suddenly, he felt an unstoppable anger and humiliation welling up in his chest. He raised his head and glared at Dean with bloodshot eyes. However, all he saw was the same indifferent face. He gritted his teeth and even bared his teeth. He really wanted to punch and break Dean's face. But he knew that he would be defeated before he could hit Dean. Time passed slowly in the stalemate. The humiliation and anger slowly weakened again. The hunger and thirst turned into the voice of the devil, repeatedly hypnotizing himself in his mind. As long as he took a breath, he would be free. No one saw him here. He didn't lose face, moreover. He had already lost to Dean. He didn't have any face left, his boots were clean. He didn't step on them, he slowly stretched out his hand. His hand trembled as he picked up the cigarette. There was a trace of moisture in his eyes. At the same time, a strong hatred and killing intent sprouted in his heart. but he lowered his head. He didn't dare to let Dean notice. With a clatter, a box of matches was thrown in front of him. Dean turned back to Aisha and said to Nicotine, "Go to the basement and get another bottle of sleeping medicine." "Yes." Nicotine nodded. He secretly looked at the Pope, who had unknowingly knelt on the ground. There was a bit of complex and fear in his eyes. Richelieu couldn't wait to light the cigarette. He put it in his mouth and inhaled. He felt that he had jumped from hell to heaven. The unbearable itch and the crazy feeling of emptiness instantly disappeared. There was only a comfortable feeling as if he had fallen into the clouds. There was no trace of pain. It was as if his soul had left his body and was soaring in the sky. There was a trace of emotion in Dean's eyes as he looked at Richelieu's intoxicated face. He knew that the liquid of the mulberry leaf had completely penetrated into his bloodstream. He couldn't quit anymore. Moreover, every time after the injection, he would have to endure to the limit. Then he would have to take the mulberry leaf again and again. This kind of relapse would only make the addiction stronger and more difficult to resist. Moreover, the effect of this thing had been shown. Not only was it intoxicating, but it would also wear down a person's willpower, spirit, and other aspects. Dudien asked Nicholas to give the sleeping pill to Richelieu, who had finished smoking the mulberry leaf cigarette. Soon Richelieu fell asleep. Dudien left the castle with Aisha after giving a few words to Nicholas. In a castle of Lone Town. This was a small town near the bustling western district of the commercial district. Although it was a town, it was extremely prosperous. The people living in this town were either rich or noble. Magistrates, priests of the Holy Church, and teams of patrolling soldiers could be seen everywhere on the street. The public security here was very safe. For more than a decade there hadn't been any attack by the Dark Believers. The lord of this town was the Ruckland family. This family name was very famous. Almost everyone in the upper class knew about it. One of the 8 cardinals of the Holy Church was the current patriarch of this family. At this moment, in the underground of the main castle of the Ruckland family, enthusiastic cheers sounded outside a round platform. This was an extremely spacious underground plaza, built exactly like the arena outside. The high dome was inlaid with many expensive fluorescent stones, and the faint light cast down illuminated the interior of the plaza. At the same time, it was a little dark and hazy. At this moment, on the round stage of the arena surrounded by iron wires, a brawny man who was nearly 2 meters tall was fighting with a petite woman who was less than 1.7 meters tall. This woman had wheat skin and brown hair. At first glance, it was obvious that she was a commoner. There were many scars on her body, but the most eye-catching thing about her was her extremely revealing attire. She only had a tube top on her upper body and a pair of short underwear on her lower body. The clothes of the strong man were also very simple. His upper body was naked and he was wearing shorts. His muscles were bulging like dragons. He looked like a human-shaped tank. Kill. 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 Kill her. Kill this bitch. Some people covered their mouths with their hands and used them as microphones to make their voices louder. Most of these people had golden hair and wore expensive silk clothes. They wore gold, silver, and jade accessories. They had an extraordinary temperament. However, at this moment they were like a group of ordinary people watching a show. They were wholeheartedly shouting and cheering. Bang! The strong man seized the opportunity and fiercely punched the woman's abdomen. The woman immediately coughed out a mouthful of blood. Her body bent like a shrimp. The strong man's face was ferocious. He mercilessly grabbed her hair and punched her in the face. With a bang, the woman's nose was broken and blood flowed out. Seeing the huge disparity in strength in this fierce battle, the cheers below the stage became even crazier. Countless people shouted excitedly, and at the same time, there were people throwing gold coins on top of the barbed wire. The sound of gold coins falling on the stage was extremely pleasant to the ears. Hit her chest. Beat this bitch to death. Crush her body. Chapter 6:27. The brawny man had no tenderness for the fairer sex. With a ferocious expression, he grabbed the woman's hair with one hand and punched her face with the other. His moves were simple and violent. Every time he pulled back his fist, thick blood would stick to his fist like silk. Then, he would send his fist back to the woman's face. The woman screamed in pain, holding the arm of the strong man and struggling, but it seemed like she was shaking an iron wall. Her struggle soon weakened, and the screams gradually stopped. The arm that was holding the strong man drooped down powerlessly, leaving only a slight moan of pain. "Blow her head off! Harder, harder!" The audience cheered crazily. The strong man raised his head and looked around, then his eyes fell on the woman in his hand. He raised his fist and punched her forehead. He punched her again and again until the back of his hand was numb. At this time, the woman even stopped moaning and stopped breathing. The strong man loosened the hand that was holding her hair, and the woman fell down and fell heavily on the stage. Her head was tilted, and a face that had been smashed was powerlessly looking at the barbed wire and the excited roaring faces outside the barbed wire. Her only remaining eye was drooping, lifeless and empty. No one noticed that in her dark, mirror-like pupils, a figure flashed past. Behind the spectator seats of this small underground arena was a narrow passageway. Behind the passageway was a circular wall that surrounded the arena on all four sides. Spacious passageways were set apart from each other. At this moment, people were leaving the spectator seats one after another, turning around and entering the dark passageway at the back. The rest of the people were still sitting in the spectator seats, excitedly preparing to watch the next match. The dark aisle was inlaid with sparse fluorescent stones, which looked much more luxurious than cheap oil lamps. The long aisle was extremely deep, and there were several forks. The people who came here were obviously very familiar with these forks, and they all walked to the place they wanted to go. Prana walked to the leftmost fork of the long aisle. On the wall of this long aisle, there was a door at regular intervals. Obviously, there were rooms inside. Prana walked to the dark golden patterned door with the number 108 engraved on it. As soon as he approached it, he heard a burst of childish crying. He sighed in his heart, knowing that this man was addicted to playing again. He raised his hand and knocked lightly on the door, then stood respectfully at the door, waiting for a response. A moment later, an irritated voice came from the room. "Who's so blind? Do you want to die?" Prana hurriedly said respectfully, "Sir, it's me. Sir Ruckland asked me to pass a message to you." Although Ruckland was a surname, with the addition of Lord, there was no doubt that it was Ruckland West. "Come in." The irascible voice inside said in a low voice, filled with suppressed anger. The door was opened from the inside. A fair-skinned young knight smiled at Prana and said softly, "Please, sir." "Thank you." Prana didn't dare to be negligent. He knew that this person was the Lord's trusted aide and the man he doted on the most. When he entered the room, the faint childish voice that he had heard earlier became even clearer. He saw that this was an extremely spacious room with a large bed and a few wardrobes. In addition, there were some shelves with strange utensils hanging on them, as well as a weapon rack. The things on the rack were not swords or sabers, but whips and ropes with dense iron spikes. At first glance, it looked like a torture room for prisoners. Prana looked to the side of the bed and saw a slender middle-aged man leaning on the big bed with two small figures in his arms. One was a little girl about 7 or 8 years old, and the other was a little boy about 4 or 5 years old. The two children's skin was relatively clean. Obviously, they did not come from poor families. There were no dark spots on their hands and faces. They looked extremely cute. However, at this moment, there were obvious tears on the two children's faces, and their black eyes were filled with fear. Every time the middle-aged man's hand touched their hair, the fear in their eyes would increase a bit. In addition to these two children, there were 3 other children on the bed, but they were all sitting on the edge of the bed, their bodies curled up, trembling, and making soft sobbing sounds. Prana glanced at them. Although he felt uncomfortable, he didn't frown. He looked extremely calm on the surface. If it was him 10 years ago, he wouldn't be able to be so calm. Sir Ruckland asked me to tell you that there's news from His Excellency the Pope, Prana said respectfully. The middle-aged man on the bed raised his eyebrows and snorted coldly. Is he dead or alive? Hearing his rude words, Prana wasn't surprised at all. He still said respectfully, His Excellency the Pope seems to be fine, but after holding the blessing ceremony in Martha Square, he disappeared again. What's going on? The middle-aged man said unhappily. What's this old guy doing running around? Prana said respectfully, Sir Ruckland asked me to bring a message to you, sir, to talk in detail. So annoying. The middle-aged man was a bit impatient, but even so, he still slowly sat up from the bed and used his hands to pinch the soft cheeks of the two children. The irritation in his eyes suddenly turned into greed and desire. He licked his lips, picked up the little girl, and kissed her hard. The little girl was so scared that she tried to resist, pushing his chest with her little hands, but how could she move him at all? Suddenly, the little girl screamed and cried loudly. At this time, the middle-aged man opened his mouth, but there was half a piece of soft flesh in his mouth, and he chewed it gently. It was the little girl's lips. Delicious. The middle-aged man closed his eyes and chewed with great enjoyment. After chewing and swallowing, he slowly opened his eyes and touched the head of the little girl who was crying in pain. There was a doting fatherly look in his eyes. He said softly, Be good, be obedient, understand? The little girl couldn't stop crying. She screamed in pain, tears streaming down her face. The middle-aged man smiled and got off the bed. He stepped on the clean wooden floor with his bare feet and said to the fair-skinned young knight by the door, Bring my clothes. The young knight nodded respectfully, took out a luxurious suit from the wardrobe, and put it on for him. The middle-aged man stretched out his hands like a hanger, enjoying his service. When the young knight put on his tie, he asked, You're not jealous, are you? How could I be? The young knight's face was slightly red. The middle-aged man laughed and adjusted his tie himself. He looked at his attire in the mirror outside the wardrobe and was quite satisfied. Then, he took out a precision mechanical watch made by a master craftsman and put on a hat. He looked elegant, and it was obvious that he was a person of great etiquette and education. Let's go, the middle-aged man said. The young knight glanced at the 5 children on the bed and said, What about them? As usual, kill them and feed them to the little loach. The middle-aged man said casually, and then he buttoned his sleeves while turning around, ready to go out. You haven't even put on your clothes, why are you in such a hurry to go out? A calm voice sounded. When the middle-aged man heard this voice, he didn't think much about it. He looked down and immediately saw that the buttons on his clothes were not fastened properly. He frowned and was a little angry. Suddenly, the young knight behind him cried out in surprise, You, who are you? Hearing this, the middle-aged man suddenly reacted, and all the hair on his body stood up. He looked up and suddenly saw that there was a figure in a black robe standing by the door. The loose hood covered most of his face, revealing a fair and handsome chin. Chapter 6:28. Hearing the word supervisor, the middle-aged man's face suddenly changed. He looked at Dean angrily. Who are you? There were very few people in the outer wall who knew his name. Even the Ruckland family didn't know his identity. They only knew that he was a big shot from the inner wall and had extraordinary power. Are you Prince Riley? Prana recognized Dean's appearance by the glimmer of the fluorescent stone. Why are you here? Didn't you go missing? Riley? Middle-aged man asked. Do you know him? Prana hurriedly said, Sir, His Highness Riley was the most outstanding knight of the Vatican in the past 20 years. He was extremely talented in sword arts and came from a noble family. However, he should have been missing for a long time. I heard that he died in the line of duty. I didn't expect. That's weird. Wasn't His Highness Riley blonde? Why is his hair black now? Holy Church? Middle-aged man was relieved as he heard Dean's words. He thought that Dean was from the inner wall when Dean revealed his real identity. He didn't expect Dean to be a knight from the Holy Church in the outer wall. The most outstanding knight of the Holy Church in the last 20 years. The middle-aged man completely disdained Dean's words. No matter how smart you are still a lowly person. I usually don't like to be long-winded when I kill people. Dean slowly raised the dagger in his hand. But for a person like you, it's too easy to kill him with a sneak attack. Death isn't terrible because you won't even feel pain after death. So why should you be afraid? So I have to slow down the process of your death. I will let you taste your own death in order to let you experience fear and despair. Dean's dark eyes narrowed as he spoke. There was a trace of malice in his eyes. The middle-aged man heard Dean's words and sneered. You know my identity, but you still dare to come here to die. I advise you to honestly confess who sent you here. You probably don't know that the purpose of the person who sent you here is to send you to your death. Because he didn't clearly tell you how strong I am. Whoosh! A sudden gust of wind interrupted the rest of his words. Suddenly, an incoming fist smashed into his face. With a bang, his body flipped backwards and fell onto the soft bed behind him, rolling a few times. Puff, puff. At the same time, the sound of two blades rubbing against flesh echoed. Prana and the young knight were stunned as they looked at Dean. Their mouths slightly opened, but they couldn't say a word. Blood spurted out from their throats as they stiffly fell on their back. The middle-aged man was lying on the bed. His mind was a mess, his ears were buzzing, and he felt dizzy. He struggled to turn his head and saw Dean standing beside the bed, looking at him condescendingly. It seemed that Dean had no intention of continuing to attack. He took a deep breath, and the dizziness immediately subsided. He hurriedly supported himself with his palms and leaped backward, landing on the other side of the bed. He bent down and quickly searched under the bed. Soon, he pulled out a bright silver sword. The tinnitus and dizziness disappeared after he held the sword. He stared at Dean, who was on the other side of the bed. His heart was full of shock. Didn't Prana say that Dean was a knight of the Holy Church? Wasn't the upper limit of strength in the outer wall a senior hunter? But he couldn't react to the power and speed that Dean had used. He was a primary limitless hunter. Moreover, he had mastered 2 secret combat techniques taught by the monastery. It was rare for him to be defeated in a fight against someone of the same rank. But he was defeated in a single move. Moreover, he had lost completely. If this person had attacked a weapon just now, then he would have been dead by now. Although he was careless, but the speed that exceeded his reaction speed was not something that a hunter could achieve. Even if he had an extremely rare magic mark. Dean looked at him indifferently. His motionless body suddenly flashed, and the sudden fast movement made the middle-aged man's eyelids jump. He could barely see a vague shadow. He was scared and hurriedly waved his knife. Silver light flashed, and countless knife lights formed a shield in front of him. Suddenly he felt pain in his feet, as if he was hit by a hard steel rod. His body instantly lost balance and fell down. His heart sank, and a gap appeared in the dense saber light. He raised his other hand to support himself and stabilize his body, but a black light suddenly shot out from the gap of the messy saber light and hit his chest. A heart-wrenching pain shot through him, and his back smashed hard against the wooden floor. All of this took a long time to describe, but it all ended in a matter of seconds. The middle-aged man was about to fight back when he felt the pain in his chest. But he felt that his right hand that was holding the sword was pinched by a cold palm. It was not so much a palm but a piece of ice. Gotcha! The bones and joints of his wrist were twisted and dislocated. He roared in pain and raised his other hand. However, his other hand was also pinched by a strong palm. He couldn't break free as a burst of pain came. His left hand was also twisted and dislocated. You like children, so I'll let you become a child. Dean's indifferent voice came out unhurriedly. There was no trace of trembling in his voice. It seemed that he still had some strength left in him after the fierce battle. The middle-aged man didn't react to Dean's words. He felt that his feet were pinched. The next moment he suddenly understood. A burst of crisp and powerful sounds of bones breaking rang out, like the sound of bamboo being chopped. The pain that came instantly caused the middle-aged man to scream. However, just as he screamed, something was stuffed into his mouth, and he immediately turned into a muffled sound. In the blink of an eye, Dean folded the middle-aged man's limbs into a cross. He sat on the folded hands and feet and looked at the back of the middle-aged man's head. He gently cut the middle-aged man's ear with a dagger. With a little force, one of the middle-aged man's ears was cut off. Blood gushed out like a fountain. The middle-aged man trembled and screamed in pain. You could have enjoyed the treatment of a quick death. There was no pain. Dean used the dagger to cut wounds on the middle-aged man's face and neck. From time to time, he stabbed the dagger into the bloody seam of these wounds. He indifferently said, "But your mistake is to kill people unnecessarily. You have to know that people live in groups, so other people are a resource, but you needlessly waste this precious resource. It's really stupid." The middle-aged man's facial features twisted in pain. He screamed in pain. Dean rotated the dagger and quickly cut all parts of the middle-aged man's body. He cut off the broken hands and feet piece by piece. One of the arms was cut off to expose the bones. After more than 10 minutes, he ended the middle-aged man's life. When he got up, the 5 children on the big bed were scared and hurriedly shrank to a corner, shivering. Dean glanced at the children's fear. As if he was talking to himself, he whispered, "In your eyes, I'm no different from him, isn't it?" The 5 children just looked at him in fear. The girl who had her lips bitten off was too scared to cry. Maybe there is a little difference. Dean saw their expressions and said to himself, "A little more terrible." He put on the hood again, but only covered his hair. Then he walked around the big bed, opened the door and walked out of the room. When he was torturing the middle-aged man, he always used thermal vision to observe the outside of the room. The reason why he ended the torture of the middle-aged man was because he saw the opportunity to leave. After leaving the room, he didn't walk a few steps. When he passed a fork, he met 2 blonde young nobles. The 2 smelled of alcohol, but they were not drunk. Dean deliberately walked between the 2 of them and pushed their shoulders away. The 2 felt a little pain from the bump. They immediately shouted at Dean, who was walking in front of them, "Brat, stop! How can you walk? Are you blind?" Dean turned his head and glanced at them. The faint fluorescent stone on the wall shone on his face. The 2 nobles were about to curse, but when they saw Dean's face, they were shocked. They saw that Dean's face was stained with blood. With a pair of cold eyes, the 2 suddenly felt a chill from the soles of their feet. Dean took back his eyes, turned his head and quickly left. The 2 nobles looked at Dean's back as he disappeared into the passage. They slowly looked at each other and saw the surprise in each other's eyes. Inside the castle, Rookland West frowned. He didn't expect Prana to not return yet. He immediately called the butler and was about to ask him to send someone to call him again. Suddenly, there was a clanking sound of hurried armor outside. "Elder, there is an accident underground." A knight wearing a special heavy armor of the Rookland family ran in. "There is news from the people who are on duty underground. Mr. Prana and the elder, they died in the room." Chapter 629. They died in the room? Rookland West suspected that he was hallucinating and frowned. "Say it again. Who died?" "My lord, it's Mr. Prana and the lord. They are dead." The heavy-armored knight glanced at him and said in a careful tone. Suddenly, he suspected that the armored knight in front of him was messing with him. If Prana was dead, he could accept it. But how could that lord, a master who was even stronger than the great Light King, die here? Who in the entire outer wall could kill him? Was it someone from the inner wall? Such a thought flashed in his mind. He looked at the armored knight. Are you sure? Absolutely. The armored knight bowed his head. Ruklan's face changed as he got up. Take me to see. The armored knight got up and led the way. A moment later, the two of them arrived at room 108 in the underground passage. At this moment, the underground world had been sealed off, and Rukland West's secret army was guarding the various passes. Rukland's heart sank as he opened the door to the room. He smelled the smell of blood and the sound of sobbing. He looked up and saw several of his men standing in the room to protect the scene. There were 2 corpses lying on the floor. They were Prana and the personal attendant of the Lord. His expression changed slightly as he asked in a deep voice, "Where is his corpse?" "My lord, here." A middle-aged man with a scar on his face whispered. Rukland Steeder hoped to hear the word "no" from his mouth, but when he saw the direction he was pointing in, his heart turned completely cold. On the other side of the bed, there was a large amount of blood and messy minced flesh. In addition, there were severed arms. It was like a slaughterhouse. He slowly walked over and immediately saw a mutilated body lying on the ground. Only the clothes were recognizable to him. Even the face had been cut so badly that it was completely indistinguishable. Even if he was experienced and had witnessed hundreds of crimes committed by the evil people of the Dark Church, he was still disgusted by this scene. He wanted to vomit. It couldn't be said that there was a corpse on the ground. It was a pile of flesh and blood. Moreover, it was obviously destroyed by someone. It was hard to imagine how much pain and fear the deceased must have suffered before their death. It was hard to imagine how much despair and pain they must have felt. He took a deep breath and felt the stench of blood flowing in his chest, making him nauseous. He raised his hand to pinch his chin and cover his nose. He slowly turned around, his mind spinning. Judging from the clothes and the mechanical watch on the wrist, the deceased was undoubtedly His Excellency. However, who was the person who could kill that lord? There must be unimaginable hatred to kill him in such a cruel way. Could it be that his enemies from the inner wall have come to find him? Will his enemies vent their anger on me? Thinking of this, he felt a chill run down his spine. He suddenly felt that his surroundings were filled with danger, filled with invisible arrows, knives, and spears. He deserved to die. Rukland West took a deep breath as he glanced at the people around him. How long has he been dead? How did the murderer sneak into our Rukland family and assassinate him? The people around him looked at each other but couldn't answer. But they knew that the master suspected that there was a mole in the family. Rukland West slowly glanced at the expressions of the people around him. His eyes shifted to the shivering children on the bed. He naturally didn't suspect that there was a mole among his men. How could a person who could kill the Lord need a mole? He was just worried that the person hadn't left but was still mixed in with his team of knights. "Have you been here all this time?" Rukland West asked the children. He had long been aware of the Lord's special hobbies. He had ordered people to find these children for him. The children looked at him with their black and white eyes. Their faces were full of fear. Rukland West frowned slightly and turned around. "These children are witnesses. They must have seen the entire process of the murderer's crime. Take them away and interrogate them about the murderer's appearance. Remember, don't scare them anymore. Otherwise, they'll have a mental breakdown and nothing will come out of them." "Yes." The middle-aged man nodded. "In addition," Rukland West continued, "don't spread this matter out. You will be responsible for half a word." "Yes." Several people replied in unison. "Father." At this time, an urgent voice came from outside. A youth with brown hair quickly ran in. Rukland West frowned as he looked at his son's brown hair. "What's the matter?" The youth replied, "Father, I found 2 witnesses. They should know some clues." Rukland West's eyes lit up as he said, "Bring them here." The youth immediately said, "Father, I've already interrogated them. The 2 of them told me what happened. According to the time of the crime, when it happened, they happened to pass by outside and were about to go out to gamble. In the end, they met a person in the corridor. That person's face was covered in blood and it scared the two of them, but they didn't think much about it. They thought that the person had played with one of the slaves and went overboard. Later on, they found out that an important person had died here, so they associated it with that person. Then they told this matter to their good friend, the guard, and the guard told me. Rookland West was startled and immediately said, "You mean they bumped into the murderer in the corridor?" "Yes," the youth said. "At that time the murderer was in a hurry and bumped into them. That's how they noticed the murderer's face." Rookland West immediately said, "Immediately find a painter and cooperate with them. Draw the murderer's face and publish it on the wanted list of the Dark Church. Let the Dark Church find the murderer for us." The youth respectfully replied, "Father, I have found a painter to draw the murderer's portrait. I will immediately send it to my elder brother. He has a lot of connections. I will ask him to publish it on the Dark Church's list." Rookland West didn't expect the son he disliked the most to be so efficient. He had looked down on him in the past. He immediately said, "Let me have a look first." The youth respectfully handed it over. Rookland West opened the portrait. It was an extremely lifelike sketch. He looked at it and suddenly felt that this person was somewhat familiar. After looking at it carefully for a moment, he suddenly thought of someone. Riley? The long-lost swordsman? There was a trace of surprise in Rookland West's eyes. He carefully looked at the portrait and felt that it was very similar. However, this portrait was somewhat different from the one he had seen. It should be the difference between the two eyewitnesses and the painter's understanding. Is it just a person who looks similar? Riley? How could it be him? How could he kill him? Riley was the Pope's favorite knight. His disappearance has always been a mystery. Did the Pope deliberately arrange all of this? Did he secretly send him to the inner wall for further study? Rookland West's heart was a bit scared. The Pope had the authority to enter the inner wall. It shouldn't be difficult for him to send someone to the inner wall. If that was the case, then wasn't the disappearance of the Pope a part of the Pope's plan? Moreover, the most important thing was, why did the Pope send him to assassinate the elder? Was it because he was aware of the forces that he was secretly operating and was ready to deal with him? Chapter 630. A young commoner held the hand of a veiled woman in a purple cheapao as they walked out of Lone Town. They didn't follow the official road that was crowded with vehicles. Instead, they went straight to the dense forest in the nearby wilderness and traversed through it. There were many ferocious beasts such as wild wolves, snakes, and pigs in the wilderness, so civilians did not dare to approach. However, there was a transport trail in the dense forest. This was a shortcut opened by the caravan in a hurry. When the caravan passed through this place, they would often hire some retired soldiers or adventurers who had explored the radiation zone as guard. After all, in this dense forest, in addition to the wild wolves and hungry tigers, it was said that there were also robbers and bandits, and there were even some dark cultists who made people tremble with fear. They were doing secret and evil experiments here. Dean took Aisha along the caravan trail. Russell. On the way, a few robbers wearing green grass clothes suddenly jumped out of the grass and blocked Dean's way with knives. "Haha, boss, we met a fat sheep in the first time we came out." "Stutter, don't talk so much. You're losing your momentum." "Humph, you two dare to come here. You're simply courting death." "Boy, hurry up and—" The robbers hadn't finished their opening lines when Dean's figure suddenly sped up. He waved his wrist and the bell jingled. Seeing him rushing towards them like a gust of wind, the bandits were immediately dumbfounded and stunned on the spot. Dean and Aisha jumped at the same time and flew over the heads of the robbers. They jumped to a height of more than 10 meters and fell behind the robbers. They continued to run without looking back. The robbers looked back and saw that Dean and Aisha had run far away. They could only see their backs in the distance. "Boss, have you ever seen a person who can jump to the top of a tree?" "Boss, I want to go back and be a good person." Dean walked along the dense forest. Along the way, he met a hungry tiger, but he easily killed it. 10 minutes later, he left the dense forest and came to a village. Then he went straight through the outskirts of the village and rushed to the residence of the next dean through the nearest road. Padre Commercial Street was one of the 4 great economic centers of the business district. There were all kinds of large-scale trade markets, as well as various kinds of entertainment industries. Among them, the most profitable place was undoubtedly the largest casino in Padre Commercial Street. There was a square outside the Vero Casino. The main purpose of this square was not to hold a prayer ceremony for the Holy Church or to set up sculptures to worship the ancestors and gods. It was for the rich and nobles who came to the Vero Casino to park their carriages. The square was full of carriages all year round. There were all kinds of carriages and the badges and flags of various noble families. At this moment, in a luxurious room on the top floor of Vero Casino, 7 or 8 blonde and fair-skinned nobles sat around a round table. This was a top-notch room for nobles. The minimum amount of chips in the casino was equivalent to 50 years of savings for an ordinary family. There were fruit juices, champagne, food and so on next to the gambling table. Akane spun the chips in his hand. After a while, he sighed and got up to leave the table. He patted the knight behind him on the shoulder. "Come play for me," he said. "I need to get some luck." The knight respectfully replied, "Yes." It wasn't the first time he encountered such a situation. Usually when Ikone lost a lot, he would let the knight replace him to play for a few rounds. Akane didn't watch from the side but went to the rest area of the box. From here he could overlook most of the scenery outside the casino. The bustling streets were bustling with pedestrians, and there were countless luxury carriages parked in the distance. Such a beautiful scene could only be seen in the bustling cities of the inner wall. But the cost of living in the bustling cities of the inner wall was too expensive. Even a noble like Akane would feel distressed at the expense of living in such a bustling city. He gently tasted the red wine. Although he had lost a lot today, it didn't affect his mood. He was in a good mood ever since he came to the outer wall. The barren, backward and dirty area was far cleaner and richer than he had imagined. It gave him a big surprise. He even felt that it wasn't a bad thing to live here in his later years. It was better to be treated as a lord by a group of untouchables than to be despised by a group of real nobles. "Sir, this is Snow Mountain truffle. It is very expensive. You can't find it in the inner wall. You can try it." Another knight pointed to a plate of food on the table and recommended it to Ikone. Ikone looked at it and scooped a little with a spoon. He felt that the taste was soft and sweet. It was extremely refreshing and delicious. He couldn't help but praise. "The people of the outer wall are better at enjoying food than us." The knight smiled. "This is the food that the nobles of the outer wall are entitled to enjoy. These nobles have learned our etiquette education, so they know how to enjoy food." Ikone looked at him. "Everything here is good, but there is one thing that makes me feel uncomfortable. Do you know what it is?" The knight bowed his head. This subordinate doesn't dare to speculate. "It's them." Ikone's tone was obviously directed at the people around the other side of the box. "I feel disgusted when I see the untouchables have the same blonde hair as me." The knight immediately realized that he had made a slip of the tongue and hurriedly said, "Your subordinate understands. Untouchables will always be untouchables. Even if they are mixed-blood untouchables, they will have the same blood flowing in their veins." Ikone coldly said, "This is something that can't be changed. It's like the barbarians outside the borders. Even if they kidnap civilians to give birth to their children, they will still give birth to uncivilized bastards." The attendant broke out in a cold sweat. He lowered his head and said, "Sir is right." Ikone glanced at the blond youth on the other side of the table. "What are you looking at?" The blond youth quickly replied, "Nothing. I think I heard wrong." He turned back to the table, and no longer cared about the things that had nothing to do with him. Ikone finished the truffle and looked outside. Seeing that it was getting late, he said, The Camilla family has invited us for lunch. Let's get ready to go. Yes. The knight acknowledged respectfully and went to the side of the table. He called for the knight who had replaced Iconi to get ready to leave. A fat middle-aged man sitting at the head of the table saw that Iconi was about to leave and hurriedly got up. "Mr. Iconi, are you going back so early? Why don't you play a little longer? If you don't have enough money, I can lend you some." "No need," Iconi said indifferently. "I have an invitation for lunch. I'm going." The middle-aged man understood and smiled. "Then I won't hold you back. Have a safe trip, come back next time." He reached out to hold Iconi's hand and sent him to the door. "You can continue playing." Iconi let go of his hand and left with the two knights. When the door to the box closed, he took out a handkerchief and wiped his fingers. After wiping them clean one by one, he crumpled the handkerchief into a ball and threw it into the rubbish bin in the corridor. Soon, the three of them left the Grand Casino and arrived at the carriage in the square. The two knights escorted him into the carriage. Iconi's pupils shrank as soon as he entered the carriage. He saw two figures sitting silently in the spacious carriage, a man and a woman, silent like two ghosts. Chapter 631. Dean grabbed his collar and pulled his body into the carriage. The two knights outside didn't notice the assassination. One of the knights jumped into the carriage and acted as the coachman. They were ready to set off. The other knight waited for Iconi's body to fully enter the carriage before grabbing the door and climbing the stairs into the carriage. As soon as he entered, he, who habitually lowered his head in humility, saw 6 feet in the carriage. He looked up and saw a flash of silver light. Then he didn't know what happened. The dead knight fell down and hit the carriage. The knight outside was aware of a trace of strangeness. "Sir?" There was no response. A streak of silver light suddenly shot out from the curtain and pierced his throat at lightning speed. Then, it was quickly pulled out and returned to the carriage. The knight clutched his throat and looked at the carriage in horror. Although the carriage was fast, he clearly saw the hand holding the dagger. It was not Iconi's hand, nor was it his companion's hand. There was someone else hiding in the carriage. His eyes were filled with fear. He couldn't stop the blood from flowing out of his throat. He opened his mouth slightly, wanting to call for help, but he couldn't make a sound. All his strength and thoughts seemed to have been sucked out of him. His vision went black, and he collapsed. Dean took Aisha out of the carriage. It was as if they were a noble couple going to a banquet. They walked along the aisle and left the square where countless carriages were parked. Not long after they left, an aristocrat came to stop the carriage. He accidentally saw the knight lying on the carriage frame. He wondered who the servant was. How could he sleep here without any manners? Soon, the nobleman noticed the blood dripping from the carriage frame and the pool of blood on the ground. Only then did he notice that the knight's posture was too strange, as if he was about to fall off the ground. The aristocrat immediately let his guard come forward to check. Soon the news of the knight's death reached the aristocrat's ears. The news quickly spread to the streets outside the square. The patrolling soldiers and knights of the magistrate were alarmed. The atmosphere of terror spread. Aristocrats and rich people who came to play heard the news and immediately drove away. One had to know that in such a prosperous economic center, someone was actually assassinated here. This was simply terrifying for them. No one was willing to stay in the same environment with an unknown murderer, especially the security here, which was known as an impenetrable wall. They could no longer be trusted. The afternoon passed quickly. At 3:00 in the afternoon, Dean arrived at the 9th region of the Dark Church. After a whole morning of hunting, he had beheaded all 5 supervisors. Except for the child abuser that he had encountered at the beginning, which took him a bit of time, the rest of the 4 supervisors were taken care of. He could come and go freely in the secret places of the outer wall without any difficulty. "Stop!" The guard stopped Dean. Dean took out a great potion master's identity token and handed it to the guard. The guard looked at him and was shocked. He didn't expect the young man in front of him to be a great demonic apothecary. Cold sweat broke out all over his body as he respectfully said, "Greetings, Mr. Great Demonic Apothecary." Dean took Aisha's hand and entered together with her. Dean went directly to the second floor of the dark hall after arriving at the underground world of the castle. He followed the smell and found Hawkeye. At the same time he noticed the undercover wolf, who was confessed by Richelieu. "Elder, you are here." Hawkeye's attitude was very respectful as he saw Dean. He had heard about Dean suppressing the 12 elders of the Fillen family. He knew that the youth in front of him had terrifying strength. Even if Hawkeye didn't rely on him, he didn't have a second choice. Hawkeye could only hug him tightly. Dean said, "Call the wolf." "Yes." After a moment, Wolf was summoned by Hawkeye. Wolf was a bit nervous as he saw Dean again. He didn't dare to put on airs. His attitude was extremely humble. "Elder, come sit in my office. The air is good there." Dean waved his hand. "It doesn't matter. I just want to ask you a few questions." "Please ask, I'll tell you everything I know," Shooting Wolf said with a smile. Dean casually said, "Tell me everything you know about Pope Richelieu. Include his relatives, friends, lovers, family and his resume when he was young and so on." Wolf was startled but soon relieved. Dean was one of the 12 elders of the Dark Church. It wasn't unusual for him to inquire about the Pope. Wolf immediately replied, "I don't know much about the Pope. I only know that the Pope was a talented knight when he was young. He was born in a noble family. However, the Pope's family has been very low-key. Not to mention the Scott and Mel families, even the other small families can't compare with them." "Is it to avoid arousing suspicion?" "That's normal." Dean nodded. "There shouldn't be many members of his family left. Has he not contacted his family for a long time?" "Yes." Shoot Wolf nodded and said, "In order to prevent the Dark Church, we threatened him, so he separated himself from his family. Moreover, he obscured his family's matters. Ordinary civilians don't even know that he has a family. They also don't know that he is a noble." Dean nodded. "What about his wife and children?" "None." Wolf shook his head. "I don't know about that." Dean quietly looked at him. He got up and said to Hawkeye, "Lead the way to the torture room. You come with me." Wolf was startled. He felt that something was wrong. Was he going to torture him? But looking at Dean's expression, it didn't seem that he was going to torture him. Moreover, there was no reason to use torture to interrogate him. He decided to take a look first, so he immediately followed behind Dean. Under Hawkeye's lead, the three of them soon came to an underground torture room built on the other side of the square. This was an important prison of the 9th area. Most of them were people from the Dark Church, while some were people from the Holy Church. There were also people from the military and magistrate. Even nobles were imprisoned here. The three of them went straight to the torture room. Dean glanced at the torture instruments in the room. There were many types of torture rooms in the Dark Church. They were 10 times more exaggerated than the torture rooms in the Thornflower prison. He was glad that he had entered the Thornflower prison and not the Dark Church's prison. His identity was different now, so he knew different things. Although the Thornflower prison was known as the number 1 prison in the outer wall, but it was only the number 1 prison on the surface. There were many other prisons that were more terrifying than the Thornflower prison. The 2 largest prisons were the penitent prison of the Holy Church and the top-secret torture chamber of the military. Anyone who was imprisoned in there was a character who could make the earth tremble. Any one of them was either a great potion master or a general-level existence. "Old man, come and have a taste," Dean said to Wolf, who was next to him. Shooting Wolf was shocked. He forced a smile and said, "Elder, you are so humorous." "It's your humor." Dean picked up a string of spikes from the wall and came in front of Wolf. He wrapped the chain around Wolf's body. Shooting Wolf was scared and didn't dare to move. He saw Dean's unhurried appearance, but he still held a hope that Dean was just trying to scare him. No matter what, he was a dignified elder, and he didn't offend Dean in any way. Hawkeye saw this scene and was a little surprised, but he hid the shock in his eyes and silently looked down at his toes, not daring to express any thoughts. Dean came to Shooting Wolf's back and pulled with his palm. Poochie sounds rang out, accompanied by the sound of clothes being cut, and Shooting Wolf's screams. Dean pulled both ends of the chain tightly. The finger-long triangular spikes on the chain pierced into the wolf's body. Blood immediately dyed his robe red. Dean tied the chain and kicked Wolf's back. Then he went to the torture rack and picked 2 new torture tools. He returned to Wolf and said, "You are an undercover agent arranged by Richelieu. You used to be the librarian of the highest library in the Holy Church. You should have read a lot of books. If you can't be honest about the situation of the Pope, then I'll have to dig out word by word." Shooting Wolf, whose whole body was in incomparable pain, heard Dean's words. His whole body suddenly felt cold, and even the pain in his body suddenly disappeared. He looked at Dean in horror. If Dean had only said the first sentence, he could still refute, but he didn't expect Dean to know that he was the librarian of the library. In addition to the Pope, only a few people knew about this identity. Since Dean knew this, it was obvious that he had the exact information. Even so, he still wanted to struggle and said, "Elder, you have misunderstood me. I really am not a librarian, nor am I a spy, ignorant." Dean shook his head and immediately started the torture. Half an hour later, Shooting Wolf, who was covered in wounds and covered in blood, finally opened his mouth and revealed a lot of information. Dean wrote them down one by one and then continued to torture. Only when Shooting Wolf breathed his last breath did he confirm that he had dug out all the information he knew. There was not a trace left. Chapter 632. In a magnificent palace on Mount Wu Tuo, the maid in charge of taking care of the young master looked around the room. The room was too big, like the hall of a hall. The dome was high and the area was wide. It was hard to imagine that this was the bedroom of a child who was less than 1.6 meters tall. "Young master, come out. Don't hide." The maid shouted anxiously. His voice reverberated in the empty room and traveled very far. The maid saw that the call was useless, so she had to go inside the room to search. When she went deep into the room, a figure jumped out from behind a stone pillar near the door and quickly rushed out of the room. The sound of the door closing alarmed the maid. When she turned her head to look, she immediately turned pale with fright and hurriedly chased after the figure. "Young master, don't go out, quickly come back." As she shouted, she opened the door and chased after the figure. A small figure quickly disappeared from the corner of the corridor. Boyce ran all the way out of the square and arrived in front of a white jade staircase leading to St. Mark's Square at the top of the mountain. When the 2 Knights of Light on duty saw this young master, they immediately saluted respectfully. Boyce immediately asked, "They said that my grandfather is missing. Is it true?" The 2 Knights of Light looked at each other. One of them winked to persuade the other not to talk too much. Although Boyce was young, but he had always been clever. He shouted, "If you don't tell the truth, then I'll demote you to apprentices and hunt down the dark believers every day." The 2 Knights of Light's complexion slightly changed. Although the young master didn't have such rights, but his grandfather the Pope did. Moreover, the nurse who took care of him had always doted on him and was also one of the 8 cardinal bishops. If this little guy complained to her, she would definitely be removed from her position. Chasing the followers of darkness every day? What kind of joke was this? That was a matter of throwing one's life away. Another knight smiled. "Young master, don't worry. His Highness the Pontiff hasn't disappeared. He just encountered some problems, so he temporarily left Wu Tuo Mountain. He is secretly planning to destroy the Dark Church in another place." Boyce looked at him. "Really?" "It's true," the knight said solemnly. Boyce saw the serious look in his eyes. He snorted. Get out of the way. The two of them stepped aside. Boyce immediately ran up the stairs. He crossed 4 or 5 steps at a time. His speed was astonishing. He was like a cheetah in the forest. The two Knights of Light turned their heads and looked at the back of the young master who was flying away. They were secretly speechless. One of them exclaimed in a low voice, "Young master's strength is probably stronger than both of us, right?" "Not only that," another knight exclaimed, "the young master has been trained by the great Light King since he was 3 years old. He's already 9 years old now. If he were to fight, he might be able to fight a head commander. When the young master grows up, he will be the future great Light King." While the two Knights of Light were sighing, Boyce quickly ran up the mountain path. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the mountain forest and leaves fluttered in the air. Boyce raised his hand to cover his eyes and the wind disappeared. When he lowered his hand, he saw a shadow in front of him. "You!" Boyce looked at the man in surprise. On a small hill at the edge of Mount Utopia, there lived the apprentice knights and junior Knights of Light who were stationed here. In one of the more simple and crude houses, Barton carried his sweaty and smelly clothes, which had piled up for several days, to the well outside. He scooped up some water and poured it into a wooden basin. Then, he returned to his own room and prepared to soak these clothes for a while before washing them. He hadn't sat down when a dull voice echoed in the room, "Long time no see. How are you?" Barton was shocked. He saw a black-haired figure sitting next to his bed. Barton was stunned when he saw his face. "Dean?" He was startled for a moment before he reacted. Why are you here? Only we can come in here." Did you sneak in?" Dean quietly looked at him. "I came here to find you." "Find me?" Barton suddenly noticed that there was a child lying on the bed behind Dean. It seemed that the child was asleep. "Have you heard about my matter?" Dean quietly asked. Barton responded. He was sent to an aristocratic family by Dean. When the Holy Church was recruiting apprentice knights, he participated in the assessment. Although his hair color was not golden and his body had some deformities and problems, but because he was registered as an aristocrat, he successfully passed the assessment and became a member of the Holy Church. His life and cognition had undergone earth-shaking changes after he became an apprentice knight. He was no longer a poor boy who sneaked into the commercial district from the slums. He was no longer a bird without a nest under Dean's wings. As a trainee Knight of Light, he naturally had the right to read the newspaper of the Holy Church for free. He read a lot of things and learned a lot from it. He also read the news that Dean had colluded with the dark cultists and was arrested in the inner wall. "I heard about it." Barton looked at the living Dean in front of him. He was no longer a poor boy who could only look up at the commercial district. He knew that the inner wall was the most mysterious place. It was far more powerful than the commercial district. Even the ancient nobles who lived in the commercial district would try their best to join the inner wall. This was the best proof of that. "How come you are here? Weren't you caught in the inner wall? Did you sneak out of the inner wall?" Dean nodded and stared at him. "I need you now. Are you willing to follow me?" Barton was stunned. Continue to follow Dean? Before Dean appeared, he had tried to ask himself this question. Every night, he would secretly ask himself. The answer had been firm, but it had also been shaken. After all, the poor days in the orphanage had penetrated deep into his bones. He couldn't bear to look back. Every day after he followed Dean, he lived in fear. He was worried that the magistrate would find him. He was worried that he would be punished by the Holy Church. He was worried that he would be thrown into the fire as an evil believer. Now that he had become a trainee Knight of Light, although his life was not very good, but at least he could eat and wear warm clothes. Moreover, he was able to raise his head and walk on the street. The people around him no longer looked at him with contempt and disgust, but in awe. This was something he had never imagined before. Even when he followed Dean, He was rich, but people still looked at him with disgust because of his hair color and the radiation spots on his body. But now he didn't feel inferior because of the bright armor of the Knight of Light. Give up everything and follow him. Barton secretly asked himself. Was it worth it? Was it worth it? Was it worth it? Dean also quietly stared at him. After a long time, Barton took a deep breath and seriously looked at Dean. I'm willing. Dean was startled. There was a trace of softness in his calm eyes, but it disappeared in the blink of an eye. He calmly said, Really? Barton nodded. Really? Why? Because I said that I am willing to follow you for a lifetime. Although I am stupid, but at least I know that I must abide by my words. This is a promise. Barton said seriously. Dean was silent for a moment. Your choice is right. Barton revealed a smile, but then let out a sigh. Laughing bitterly, he said, To tell the truth, I don't know what I'm doing either. Am I crazy? How could I throw away such a good job and go crazy with you? But you were the one who gave me my life. The reason I was able to come here and join the Radiant Church was also because of you. So, although I'm a bit reluctant, I can't forget my roots, right? Dean stared at him for a moment, then slowly stood up and patted his shoulder. Barton grinned. You don't need to comfort me. We are brothers who have gone through life and death together. I'm sorry for making you lose your job. I'll make it up to you. In a few days, I'll find you a new job. I have given up such a job. I don't need to look for a new one. I will follow you. The new job is to be the Pope. Are you willing to do it? What? After leaving Barton's residence, Dean went to a nearby hotel. He saw Aisha sitting motionless in the room. He immediately went forward and whispered, I'm sorry to keep you waiting. Aisha was silent. Dean held her slender cold hand and whispered, Let's go back now. I will accompany you. You won't be angry with me, right? Aisha looked at him without any expression. Dean looked up at her, his eyes full of tenderness. Let's go. He pulled her up from the bed, then carried the unconscious Boyce and left the hotel through the window. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon by the time they returned to the castle. Richelieu was monitored in the castle. He couldn't go out or send messages. When Dean came back, he immediately saw a familiar figure. When he saw the face, he felt the blood in his body freeze. His fingers trembled, and he felt a violent anger spreading from his chest. He stared at Dean and said, What did you do to him? He is in a coma. He is not dead. Don't worry. Dean saw his reaction. It seems that we didn't catch the wrong person. Richelieu immediately came to his senses, but he still felt an uncontrollable anger. He gritted his teeth and said, He is just a child. I have already pledged my loyalty to you. Why don't you believe me? Why are you using a child to threaten me? In my eyes, he is just a bargaining chip. You. Richelieu clenched his fingers in anger. He suddenly thought of a question. How did you find him? Didn't you confess to the elder of the 9th region? Dean indifferently said, If you can betray others, then why can't others betray you? Richelieu's face changed. He won't betray me. What did you do to him? I killed him. Dean was too lazy to play with him. He was loyal to you. I tortured him to death, so that I could squeeze out your information bit by bit. It's a pity. Richelieu roared, You scum! Scum means the dregs of human beings. Obviously, I am not one of them. Dean calmly said. Richelieu roared, With your skills, there are many ways to make him confess to me. Why did you have to kill him? Because it is efficient. You! Richelieu gritted his teeth. He used to be a librarian. He never left the library. He didn't do anything bad in his life. Why are you so cruel? Pigs didn't do anything bad. Didn't they die? Dean indifferently said. Richelieu was so angry that he couldn't speak. Since you still have a benevolent heart, then cooperate with me in the future. Dean handed Boyce to Glenn. Take him away. Personally look after him. This kid's strength is close to a senior hunter. Glenn was shocked as she looked at the child in her hand. How could such a small child have strength close to a senior hunter? Comparisons were odious. She finally understood the difference between those with a background and those without. She lost at the starting line from the moment she was born. Richelieu looked at Dean in anger. He knew that it was meaningless to be angry at this time. The more angry he was, the more he would fall into Dean's trap. He took a deep breath. You have my life in your hands. If something happens, you can harvest my life at any time. Why are you doing this? It's always good to add a few more sets of protection to the cards that are useful. Dean casually sat on the sofa. Nothing will happen to you as long as you cooperate with me. What are you angry about? Are you angry that you want to betray me but you can't do anything about it? Hearing this, Richelieu immediately suppressed the anger on his face and lowered his head. No, I have never thought of betraying you. Dean waved his hand. I don't want to talk nonsense. I have solved the 5 proctors. Tell me what to do next. Richelieu's heart skipped a beat as he raised his head in shock. 5 proctors all dead? Dean nodded. Richelieu's eyelids twitched slightly. He was shocked to the extreme. In less than a day, Dean had killed 5 proctors. This speed was simply like harvesting wheat. I know. He suppressed the shock in his heart and took a deep breath. I will fully cooperate with you so that your people can ascend to the position of Pope. When he was writing more than 3,000 words, he suddenly touched the keyboard. All the words were gone. Fortunately, he repeatedly retreated a few times and came out again. Phew. Chapter 633. Dean left the castle with Aisha after dinner. They went straight along the suburbs. Half an hour later, they came to the golden wall that had been built. He looked for a place with weak guards and jumped over the wall. He ran in a certain direction. Yvette was sitting alone in front of the white waterfall. The torrent of water splashed on the bluestone in front of her. Her eyes were blurred as she looked at the countless splashes of water. She was at a loss but couldn't find the answer. After a long time she heard footsteps behind her. She woke up with a start and looked back, only to see her personal maid walking out of the forest. Your Highness. The maid was wearing a tiger skin coat. She respectfully said, It's so late. Don't you want to go back and rest? Yvette's tense nerves slowly relaxed. She looked at the broken water. You go back first. I'll sit for a while. The maid looked at her. She wanted to say something but stopped. She silently retreated into the forest. She didn't leave but quietly waited for Yvette. The silver moon shined on the waterfall. There was a trace of chill in the air. Yvette was in a daze as she looked at the surging water. Suddenly a light sound came from the jungle behind her. It seemed that a stone had fallen from the tree. She was shocked and immediately turned her head to look. Immediately, she saw 2 slender figures slowly walking out from the dense forest. The shadows of the treetops faded away and revealed their faces. Yvette was stunned as she quietly touched the dagger on her waist. It was a nightmare that she hadn't seen for a long time. She felt suffocated and even forgot to breathe. It's you. Yvette looked at the boy. Dean quietly looked at her. How are you? How did you get in? This is our forbidden area. Yvette's face slightly changed as she whispered, How did you get in? I walked in. Dean answered her and then said, It seems that you don't have a good time. Yvette immediately realized the purpose of his visit. There was a trace of alertness in her heart. She whispered, I'm doing very well. Dean's eyes were indifferent as he said, So, how is the matter that I gave you? It's still in progress. Yvette whispered, Give me a little more time, I'm sure I'll be able to complete it. Time is very precious. It's not something you can have. Dean said, What stage have you completed? Have you become the king? Yvette's expression changed slightly. Not yet. We have to take it slow. We can't rush it. In other words, your father is still here? You still can't bear to kill him, right? Dean's eyes were deep. In fact, you don't need to kill him. You can force him to abdicate. As long as the goal is achieved, it's secondary to kill him. How could Yvette not know this? But she also knew that with her father's character, it was absolutely impossible to force him to abdicate the throne, and she could not do it. Give me a little more time. I have already gotten my father's attention. According to what you said, I have performed very well. After a while, my father will pass the throne to me. I can't wait. Dean indifferently said, Now you have two choices. First, become the king. I'll help you kill him and settle everything. You just need to listen to my instructions. Second, you and your father will die together. Yvette's eyes were moist. Why? Why are you forcing me like this? You are forcing me. I can help you persuade my father. Besides, you are so powerful. You can kidnap my father and make him listen to you. Why do you have to kill him? Yvette growled with a face full of grief and indignation. Dean indifferently said, I'm old and not afraid of death. It's not easy to kidnap someone. I need a person with ambition and desire who is easy to manage. Yvette looked at him in a daze. She suddenly understood that the boy in front of her was a devil, a cold-blooded and ruthless monster. Instead of begging for his forgiveness, it was better to think of other ways to fight for a glimmer of hope. She took a deep breath and said, I can help you persuade my father. He will definitely listen to you. If you still don't want to, give me some time. Just one day. I want to try my method. There's no point in delaying. Dean coldly looked at her. I'm very disappointed in you. You. Yvette's eyes were red from anger. How many of your brothers and sisters dream of getting such an opportunity? But you don't know how to cherish it. Dean said in a cold voice. There are many people who are willing to do what you don't want to do. Yvette's face turned pale and her voice trembled. No, I beg you, don't do this. I really can't do it. I can listen to everything you say, but, you want me to kill my father. I really can't do it. Then you will accompany your father. Dean slowly walked towards her. Yvette looked at him in horror. Her eyes were full of despair. She knew how powerful this youth was. She couldn't resist him with her own strength. You are so cruel and insane. Sooner or later you will get retribution. Yvette cursed in grief and indignation. I have gotten all the retribution. Dean looked at her indifferently. It turns out that cruelty and retribution have nothing to do with each other. It's like you refused me, so you died. If you were cruel and agreed with me, you would live a better life. Can this be considered retribution? While talking, his big hand slowly stretched out. Yvette roared in grief and indignation as she waved the dagger towards Dean. Dean quickly turned his wrist and instantly knocked the dagger out of her hand. Then he lifted her body and pulled her in front of him. He grabbed her neck and twisted it. With a snap, her head was broken and she was silent. Dean slowly put down her body and threw her into the huge waterfall in front of him. Faith has harmed you, Dean muttered to himself. He slowly turned around and took Aisha's hand. They left the place. In a luxurious tent on the hill, Ayanlar was sitting on a table, burping and wiping his sword. This sword was obtained from a general he killed in the last wall battle. It was of first-class quality, much better than the weapons of the barbarians. The only drawback was that it looked good, but it wasn't durable. Chapter 634. Not a bad sword, a calm voice praised. Ayanlar was shocked and sobered up a lot. He turned around and saw two people wearing strange clothes. He had seen these strange clothes in the wall battle. They were the clothes of the people inside the wall. Assassin? Ayanlar narrowed his eyes, and a murderous look appeared on his face. How did you get in? Who was your spy? Unfortunately, I can't kill the person I want to kill the most. The sword is just scrap iron. Dudian indifferently said, Don't worry, I just want to make a deal with you. Deal? Ayanlar raised his eyebrows. Nonsense. Go to hell. He roared and rushed towards Dean with his sword. Dudian stretched out his fingers and pinched the tip of the sword. He pulled the tip of the sword and twisted it in the opposite direction. The sword was extremely elastic. It bent and stabbed towards Ianlar. Ianlar's pupils shrank as he retreated in a hurry. Dean quickly kicked Ianlar's knee. The pain made Ianlar's foot slide back and he almost knelt down. Dean stretched out his hand and grabbed Ianlar's neck. Although Ianlar had a burly barbarian's body and was more than 2 meters tall, he was squatting in front of Dean. It was difficult for him to resist as his vital parts were restricted. "Now, can we talk?" Dudian asked. Ianlar's face was full of shock, and his heart was in turmoil. But more than that, he was terrified. He never thought that with his strength, he would be subdued by someone in a single exchange. It should be known that he wasn't drunk, nor was he careless. It was just that his opponent was too strong. Whether it was in terms of strength or speed, they both far surpassed him. Talk about what?" Ianlar said reluctantly. He suddenly noticed that the commotion caused by the battle here did not alarm the attendants outside. "Could it be?" Dudian indifferently said. "I know you. You are one of the best princes. You want to be the king of barbarians, right?" Ianlar's face turned ugly. "How do you know about me? Who told you?" "Your sister, Yvette." "Her? I knew this damned bitch was up to no good." Ianlar clenched his fists angrily. Dean glanced at him. "In a way, she is better than you." Ianlar looked up at him. He did not dare to refute, but he was furious. "I came to you today mainly to help you achieve your wish," Dudian said. Ianlar was startled. He widened his eyes and said, "Help me fulfill my wish? You want me to?" "Your reaction is not slow." "Good," Dean praised, but there was no smile on his face. Ianlar's eyes were full of shock as he thought of something. He looked at Dean suspiciously. "Are you sent by my father to test me? If that's the case, isn't this method a little too weak?" Dudian indifferently said, "If your father had my help, then he would have been able to break through the wall in one fell swoop." Ianlar was startled. He knew that Dean wasn't bragging. Soon, he returned with 3 children of 7 or 8 years old, their hands and feet bound with iron chains. They were 2 boys and 1 girl, all of whom were wearing high-grade animal clothing. "Mother, brother." One of the girls was scared. She looked at her mother who was sitting in the ruins and her brother who was holding a bloody sword. She was at a loss. When the woman saw the 3 children tied up, she rushed forward to hug them, but was stopped by Ianlar's sword. "Mother, I'll give you 3 minutes to think about it. If you don't speak, I'll kill them. I'll kill one every minute. Do as you see fit." Ianlar's eyes were cold. He turned and waved at his servant. The servant next to him understood. He immediately grabbed one of the boys and put the sword on his neck. The woman saw this and shouted angrily, "Let him go! Let him go! How dare you touch the royal family? Do you want to die?" The servant's expression changed slightly. He looked at Ianlar. Ianlar looked at his mother coldly and said, "Speak. 1 minute is almost up." The woman looked at him angrily. "Your father loved you so much. Why did you do such a crazy thing? Even if you didn't do it, your father would have passed the throne to you. Why did you do such a stupid thing?" "How do I know? Now he is dead. Don't make it sound so nice." Ianlar's eyes were cold as he said, "Time is up." He waved his hand. Seeing this, his trusted aide stretched out his palm, and with a poochie sound, the sharp sword immediately pierced the boy's neck. Blood flowed out, and the boy didn't even have time to scream before he fell to the ground, dead. Ianlar's eyes were deep and cold. "Mother, are you still not going to speak?" The woman stared blankly at the boy on the ground. Her mind went blank. After a while, she slowly came back to her senses. She raised her head to look at the burly son that she was once proud of. At this moment, she felt so unfamiliar. She was startled for a moment. Suddenly, she noticed the 2 people wearing strange clothes standing behind her son. She immediately thought of the scene of these two people killing the generals who came to guard the place. She felt a chill in her heart and an indescribable anger. She said with a trembling voice, "Did you do this because you listened to their instructions? Are they the people inside the wall? You actually colluded with the people inside the wall and killed your father and brother. You. Chapter 635. You are crazy." The woman was so angry that she couldn't speak. "If this is crazy, then I would have been crazy a long time ago." Ianlar said indifferently, "It's been 2 minutes, dear mother. You've killed another one of your children." As he spoke, he raised his hand slightly. His trusted aide understood and grabbed one of the girls. His dagger fiercely pierced through the back of the girl's neck. A blood-curdling scream came to an abrupt end, and the girl's corpse fell to the ground like a withered flower. The woman was stunned for a moment. She rushed towards Ianlar and hysterically roared, "I'm going to kill you!" Ianlar frowned slightly. He flicked his wrist, and the sharp sword shot out like a silver light. With a puff, it pierced through the woman's chest. The woman's body stiffened, and she coughed out a mouthful of blood. She raised her head in disbelief and stared at Ianlar, whose expression was as cold as ice. Endless despair and sorrow slowly surged out of her eyes. "Why did you force my hands to be stained with blood?" Ianlar looked at her silently and said in a low voice. She exerted strength in her wrist and pulled the sword back. Blood splattered everywhere and landed on the scorched ground. It was a ghastly sight. The woman's body fell down like a beautiful butterfly, completely motionless. Dean's eyes flashed with killing intent. He clenched his fingers in his sleeves, but after a moment he slowly loosened them. He looked at Ianlar. "How will you rule the barbarians if you kill her?" Ianlar put the sword back into the scabbard and turned to look at Dean. "My father and mother are dead. My brothers and sisters have been beheaded by you. This place is under our complete control. Our people are everywhere. As long as we block the news and ask the prophet to recommend me to ascend to the throne, it doesn't matter if we find the Beast King card or not. I can forge one, and anyone who dares to verify it will die." Dean stared at him for a moment and nodded. "It seems that I didn't choose the wrong person." Ianlar smiled. "It's the right choice for you to choose me. From now on I'm the only king. If there is anything you need me to do, then just tell me." Dean deeply looked at him. "You don't have to worry about this. What I need you to do will only be good for you and all of your clansmen. There will be no harm." Ianlar's eyes slightly moved. "I'll come back to you after you have stabilized your position," Dean said in a cold voice. "Prepare the troops in 3 to 5 days. I'll give you an area inside the wall for you to live in. You don't have to live in this barren place anymore." "Really?" Ianlar's eyes lit up, but he was skeptical in his heart. Dean didn't want to stay any longer. He took Aisha's cold hand and left along the mountain that was covered with the flames of war and corpses. The faint smile on Ianlar's face disappeared as he looked at Dean and Aisha's disappearing figures. His eyes were cold and gloomy. "Your Majesty, we have taken control of all the troops on the mountain. Do you want to send someone to take them down?" The servant next to him said. Ianlar coldly glanced at him. "Can't you see how strong he is? He alone can slaughter all the royal family members. Who can stop him? My father's subordinate Lord Netherworld was beheaded by him." The attendant was shocked and said, This person inside the wall is so powerful?" Ianlar coldly snorted. "It's getting late. Immediately send the order to block the entire mountain. Don't let anyone leave. In addition, immediately call someone to bring the prophet." "Yes." The servant looked at the corpses on the ground. "Your Majesty, should we deal with them?" Upon hearing that, Ianlar glanced at his mother on the ground, as well as the corpses of his 2 younger siblings, as well as his other brother, whose face was pale and terrified. He was silent for a moment before he said in a low voice, "Call a few people over and carry them away. Don't destroy my mother's body. I still have a use for her. Yes. Dean held Aisha's hand as they walked in the wilderness and returned to the wall. The green grass and fragrance along the way made him slow down his pace. He turned to Haisha and said, "Do you remember the first time we met on the grassland outside the giant wall?" Aisha was silent. "I was hunting a monster at that time. Can you remember?" "Forget it. It doesn't matter if you can't remember now. You will remember it sooner or later." The two walked in the wilderness and gradually returned to the front of the golden wall. Dean looked up at the light coming from the direction of the wall. He sighed and led Aisha to find a place with weak guards. They climbed over the wall and walked all the way back to the castle. Nicotine looked at Dean as he saw him come back. "Master, I've prepared everything. What should we do next?" "Set up the factory and make the finished product. I'll give you the production process." Dean sat on the sofa and drank the tea. "I'll send a few great potion masters from the Dark Church to assist you. You just need to find a place to build the factory. If you don't have enough money, then go to Noise. He will be responsible for the funds." "Great potion masters from the Dark Church?" Nicotine was speechless. Noise could cause a sensation by stomping his feet. But now it seemed that he could only be Dean's subordinate. Noise looked at Dean. I'll be responsible for the funds?" Dudian nodded. "If you don't, then hurry up and learn. You will be in charge of the finances in the future. You will be in charge of the money of the 12 districts of the Dark Church, as well as the Holy Church and the various chambers of commerce. If you don't understand, then go to Hawkeye. He will introduce you to some excellent financial managers to teach you." Noise couldn't believe it. Finance was the lifeblood of the Holy Church. How could Dean hand over such an important thing to him? Moreover, it wasn't just a little money. It was almost all the money of the entire outer wall. It could be said that he would be the richest person in the entire outer wall in the future. I know. I'll learn right away," Noise hurriedly said. He was so excited that he wanted to shout out loud. He suddenly thought of what would happen when he returned to his family. What would the expressions of the people who had despised him when he was in prison? Thinking of this, he could not help but feel a little excited, secretly determined to learn financial management at all costs. Nicotine was jealous as he saw Dean hand over such an important matter to Noise. But he didn't dare to show it. He felt bitter and regretful. He thought that if he didn't betray Dean and was loyal to him, then perhaps he would be the one to manage the finances for Dean. After all, he was a butler, so he was the most suitable person to manage the finances. Moreover, managing the finances was just the surface. What made him jealous was that it meant that Noise would be Dean's right-hand man. It was important to know that money was indispensable. Dean gave this person to Noise, which meant that he would put him in an important position in the future. Moreover, according to Dean's current plan, he knew that this was a road of no return. Either he would fail and die, and they would be buried together with him, or he would succeed and become the top class of people. "Young master, where do we sell the finished products?" Nicotine collected his thoughts and lowered his head to ask. Dean indifferently replied, "Make them first and don't rush to sell them. The more the better." "I understand," Nicholas said respectfully. "Master." Sergei came down from upstairs and saw Dean in the living room. "Richelieu wants to see you." Dean frowned. "I'll be there in a minute." After that, he said to Nicotine, "Come to my study later, I have a list for you to help me buy some materials." "Yes," Nicholas replied respectfully. Dean went upstairs and came to the room where Richelieu lived. Sergei stood at the door and opened the door for Dean. After entering the room, Dean saw Richelieu sitting on the ground with a haggard face. There was a trace of decadence in his aura. Dean indifferently said, "You can change your clothes here. You don't need to wear such a heavy robe." Richelieu rushed forward as he saw Dean appear. "Didn't we agree before that I'm completely loyal to you? Why didn't the antidote you gave me cure the poison? How can you break your promise?" Dean indifferently said as he saw the red marks on Richelieu's arm, I was afraid that you would be disobedient, so I injected you with a strong poison. It completely mixed with your blood. You need to take the antidote a few more times if you want to cure it completely." Richelieu hurriedly said, "Then give me the antidote. First, write down the names of all the cardinals in the Holy Church and their families, and then I'll consider how much to give you." Dean calmly sat down. Richelieu hesitated for a moment but quickly returned to the table. He picked up a pen and paper and started to write. For him, he had exposed other deeper secrets to Dean, so he didn't lack this information. Moreover, with Dean's means, he didn't need to go through Richelieu to know these things. It was just a matter of time. So it wasn't a top-secret information. Soon, the information was written and handed to Dean. Dean nodded to Sergei as he looked at Sergei. Sergei went to Dudien's basement and took out the mulberry leaf cigarette. Richelieu was impatient as he saw the cigarette in Sergei's hand. Sergei wanted to dodge, but the cigarette in his hand disappeared. He couldn't help but be aghast and shocked. Dean quietly looked at Richelieu as he lit the cigarette. He slowly got up and said to Sergei, "Let's go out." Dean closed the door and looked at Sergei. "What happened to the Mel family?" "Master, I have tortured them according to your instructions. The two women are on the verge of collapse. They asked me for the antidote just like the Pope." Sergei replied truthfully. Dean nodded. "Give them the antidote every day. Only when they abandon their dignity and beg." Sergei looked at Dean. "Master, are you going to torture them for revenge? If they submit, they can set an example for the other nobles and submit to us." Dudien's eyes were calm. These aristocrats didn't learn anything else, but they learned all the problems of the aristocracy. They are arrogant and arrogant. It is difficult to tame them by force alone. They are a good example. No matter how down the Mel family is, their prestige is still there. They represent the pride of all aristocrats. Sergei suddenly realized and said, "I know." Dean patted him on the shoulder and let him continue to guard here. He went back to his study and wrote down the materials needed to build a high-voltage lightning fortress. The reason why he was ready to replace Richelieu as the pontiff after 7 days wasn't because of the difficulty of the task, but because he wanted to make time to make his own cards as soon as possible. Although he had Aisha's help, which was stronger than his original plan, but there were many strong people in the inner wall. He couldn't fully count on Aisha's strength. Time passed. The sun rose and set. The outside world continued to expose the sensational news in the outer wall as Dudien closed his door to build the lightning fortress. For example, there was a scuffle in a certain block. It was suspected that there was a war between the Dark Believers and other pagans. There were many casualties. A powerful aristocratic family suddenly announced that it was leaving the consortium. Countless people were laid off and unemployed. There were shadows of barbarians at the border.